And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, I feel like we're slipping into the Twilight Zone,
Mm-hmm.
as it were. And I feel like I'm being cloned also. It's quite a remarkable week. I mean, really, when you look at the kind of overall arc of history, and you see this week, it's been quite remarkable, and everyone should take that into account as we go into this recounting of history tonight and all the things that are going on in relation to the political process being manipulated in this country by forces that are unseen, and yet we see their footprints after the fact. And in this case, the attempted assassination against President Trump, look, this is something which, myself and others have been warning about for a while in relation to Trump. And I think that we get into, very interesting discussions about what's the better way to rule the country. And one of the things that I've noticed when we have looked into this is that often we see the perfect being the enemy of the good. And I see this over and over again, especially with the alternative voices. Of course, the corporate media is so compromised that you can't really see where they stand except with the establishment. But when you get into all these other voices, they won't get behind different candidates for different reasons. And they have a kind of purist snobbery when it comes around. And everyone should ask questions about everyone involved in the process. But the idea of the removal of the Biden regime after this record of almost 4 years of failure and complete destruction of the border and of the economy and of civil rights in America, we have to take that as legitimate about what they would do. And their track record is clear about what they want to do. So therefore, it's not a Democrat or Republican issue, although this time we side very heavily with the Republican candidate, who again acts more like an independent or populist candidate, which is the former president, President Trump. So the reason that they wanted to remove him is because they had tried every other means to neutralize his candidacy. They didn't want to walk forward onto the national stage and assassinate him. But this episode, this X series special report for you tonight, is going to be all about the deep state season of assassination, executive order, directives, and how this plays into the current cycle of election, who rules in that sense, and then, of course, the continuity of government program leaning right over our shoulder in the middle of all this. And you could have had COG raise its head immediately in the aftermath of the shooting if it had been successful. And this is the way that it works in so many of these things, whether we're talking about a UFO threat or a presidential assassination. Until it happens, you won't see the activation of these things. And therefore, to talk about them is to be aware of them, and not to be afraid of them or to spread a fear porn type thing. But to ignore them, as we've seen in so many of the different types of analysis around this, to ignore the deep state, for example, is a crucial error. And this is one of the things that we have on our side of the knowledge. And it's so crucial when looking at the assassination attempt on Trump and how it played out with the exact same CIA playbook that we've seen over and over again. And, in all the stories that we've heard about Thomas Matthew Crooks, we haven't seen anything about the CIA. And yet, who is the one, which organization in America specializes in assassination, uses assassination as a regular tool, even now, has a track record of abuses around assassination, and is heavily implicated in the assassination of a president? The record is clear. So it's interesting. There's no CIA at all. You do get them handing out the Department of Homeland Security, the Secret Service, and others. And there's so many missteps here and inconsistencies that the security stripping around President Trump was obvious. And so the conclusion that you can easily come to is that he was meant to be taken out last Saturday. And I think it was a shock and an earthquake to the entire nation, and is really just by a little bit of luck that we were able to avoid what would have been a incredibly earth-shattering moment in history, and I think would have been an absolute tragedy for the country. and for the world, really. Now, the people who are behind the assassination, this is the nature of the problem. A lot of people would look quickly to his opponent, of course, the Biden White House. But the forces, you're not going to find it even with the Secret Service director. You're not going to find it with a presidential or vice presidential candidate. It's so deep in that system about the way that these things are manipulated that we need, as we've done here in the X series and other researchers have done, you need to go past the figureheads, through them to the forces that are pulling the strings in the background, and who once in a while get rid of this or that person. After all, there were a whole bunch of never Trumpers in the Republican Party. They're still there. They call themselves the Lincoln Project. Let's not forget. And Lincoln is going to come up tonight, strangely enough, because of some code words the CIA uses in relation to assassination around Lincoln. But I would say the outcome and the kind of comeback of President Trump in the middle of all this, and doing a very successful convention all this week, there were a lot of questions about the vice presidential choice and all the rest of it. And yet, you can see the field was very limited for who he could choose. I mean, people were talking about Rubio and others who were just clearly deep state factors. And, so there was an uncomfortable thing with Vance and his closeness to this kind of tech oligarchy. But I think that Trump somehow had surmised he was going to be able to navigate this, and chose him as a kind of insurance policy, and someone who would be able to kind of help him implement what he needs to do in the next 4 years. Again, Trump, if he gets in, will have only one term, and that'll be his second term, of course. But this is the nature of the thing. There's a lot to accomplish in a short period of time, and to build the team that can take that progress into the decades ahead. This is a lot of movement here on the table around the leadership of America and the world. Of course, under Biden's leadership, we find ourselves face to face with this World War III scenario. And all these things come into play, including the fact that after the shooting, with everyone asking so many questions, they tried to blame Iran for this. I thought that was the richest moment so far of the entire thing, and smacks completely of the type of coverage that they did in other major assassination, either attempts or even with Oswald. They had done something very similar, of course, attaching Russia or Cuba to him. There's so many overlaps with him and the assassin attempter here, Thomas Matthew Crooks. It's quite remarkable because Crooks and Oswald have such a profile of overlap that it's dramatic when you read into it, the way that these things played out. And you think about that playbook of 60 years ago when they pulled this off. Well, it's interesting about Crooks because one of the things that they tried to release in the past 24 hours is that, hey, he had a whole list of people he was going to eliminate. And first of all, these assassins, I don't believe, would keep lists. They tried this with Oswald too. They said, oh, he was going to kill Richard Nixon. He was going to, he shot General Walker. He shot at him through his window. They never were able to prove that. A series of different things to set up the psychological profile. When in fact, the individual himself, Crooks, could very well have been spotted early on. He did a BlackRock commercial, as we know, for the finance firm. And, of course, that could be just completely random that they showed up at his school. But there could have been forces that became aware of him through this and thought, this guy fits the profile, we can use him. I've made a big deal on this program about Moon Township, Pennsylvania. By the way, the people in Moon are terrific, fantastic people. But Moon has had a lot of very unusual activity. For example, Gerald Ford, immediately after issuing the pardon for Richard Nixon, shows up at Moon, places a time capsule in a school. Every presidential candidate who made it always showed up in Moon Township to give a speech. A number of very compelling things. And a few years ago, I went into the history of Moon, Pennsylvania, and found that it basically had been created as a military intelligence town back during World War II. And I considered it, from all these different factoids and things, that maybe we were looking at something here that was a real Area 51 as opposed to what they talk about with Area 51. Interestingly enough, when this came up in Butler, Pennsylvania, I was thinking to myself, that's so close to Moon. I wonder if there's any connection with Crooks and Moon. And sure enough, the university that he was set to go to was Robert Morris University right there in Moon. So again, that strange shadow as we go around these events, often, I'd like to call it X-geography when these things show up over and over again. And of course, when we've done shows in the hot zone and things like that, you're always coming up against the Bahamas, in terms of political intrigue. Cuba gets raised dramatically. I saw in some of the coverage recently that they were saying, oh, Trump's speech was just like Fidel Castro. It was a long speech at the RNC. Just bringing up Castro in the middle of all this is just quite remarkable. But I think what we're going to see in terms of similarities with Oswald's situation, some of those sort of classic fingerprints of intelligence work, is the security stripping that takes place by the Secret Service for the president. And we've all seen a number of reports. Even the mainstream media isn't getting around on this one. And I think there's a strategy to that. But what's going on with the Secret Service is really it's being revealed. And I'm going to read some quotes tonight from people like Senator Josh Hawley, that it wasn't even Trump's regular Secret Service team. They were tired. Gee, I mean, that's great luck for Crooks. Just like the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald, 5.5 weeks before President Kennedy's motorcade is going to go by the window of the Texas School Book Depository, decides, hey, I really want to work there, even though the trip hasn't been announced and no one except about 2 people in the White House even know it's going to happen. But Oswald back then said, hey, that $1.25 an hour looks real good for stacking books. I think that's what I'm going to do. And it just so happened that, his ultimate ambition in life to shoot President Kennedy could be revealed in the fact that Kennedy would go right by his window. Darn the luck. Well, it looks like Crooks got some luck as well in that President Trump's security team decided, hey, we're tired. Let these other guys take over. And those were DHS agents. And there's a lot here. We've gone into DHS quite a bit, which is you're looking at 250,000 employees. And this agency, which is extra constitutional, created in the aftermath of 9/11, along with a lot of other unconstitutional things like Northcom, which, by the way, would take over in the event of continuity of government being activated, which is Northern Command. It's a military command over the United States. Well, who voted for that? I don't think that you and I will recall seeing that as a yes, no on a question anywhere. But nonetheless, this is the nature of the situation as it exists. But I think all the major factors are included in this assassination attempt, including the continuity of government players. And I'm going to explain how that all works. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. It's a very special presentation, Deep State Assassination, Executive Action Directive. This is certainly at the direction of the deep state. It's not a random incident. They're going to find eventually that there were several shooters involved. There's no question. As a matter of fact, they're already doing audio analysis that's proving there's at least 2. And I'm going to try not to get hung up on too many of the technical details here tonight because I want to show us the larger picture of what's happening with that assassination. But even, the biggest liars in the business like CNN are caving on the fact that, okay, it wasn't just, one shooter. So we're seeing this, and they're saying on Monday they're going to have a major press conference. By the way, there haven't been any briefings by the FBI on this. And one of the things that I think was incredibly telltale about it all is that immediately after the incident, you have the FBI up there hosing down the building. Hosing down is to get rid of evidence. And they said, well, we're sort of helping put the building back in order. That's destroying evidence. Just like in the case of the JFK assassination, they destroyed the limousine and they had it rebuilt immediately, where basically it's evidence in a court case. They must have known, obviously, well, there's not going to be any court case against Oswald. Ship this thing out, replace its windshield, and do all this other stuff to it. And they completely remodeled what was basically the best piece of evidence in the entire case. So they were doing some of this with the building as well. Some of you already probably know, and I've heard from a good many of you who are so well informed on this assassination attempt. I appreciate all the comments and links and stories and everything else that you've sent. But for people who don't know, one of the interesting things is that, did you know that Crooks actually encountered two policemen who spotted him on the roof, and he turned his gun on them before he shot President Trump? Now, how that didn't get President Trump off the stage, you just can't imagine. They went up on the radio, and it's interesting because, the Secret Service is completely now out of the loop in this scenario, which doesn't make any sense. Of course, the way that whole map and everything was laid out. Yeah, I've thought really about putting together just a short video with some visual aids about it because it's remarkable, but I brought some pictures tonight anyway for us to look at. One of the things I can tell you about it is the Secret Service version of events is completely untrue. So why they're lying about it to that extent and the level of their participation, I think, needs to be investigated. But there's also seems to be a factor here of somebody operating in the middle of all this who just had a complete ability to operate outside any of the parameters of local authorities or the Secret Service. This is the nature of the problem. So the Secret Service in the actual building that Crooks was shooting from, they were inside the building, but they didn't have authority to go up on the roof because, according to the director, the roof was sloped. We look at things like that and we think about the dangerous situations that Secret Service agents put themselves in all the time. That's just the most ridiculous explanation. And so she should be fired just for offering that explanation. I do think, a few things right off the bat when you're investigating a case like this, you have got to be able to put on the filter of junk conspiracy versus the real thing. And what will happen, and I've explained this as part of dark journalism in general, you have the official story, which is let out. Thomas Crooks was a lone gunman who just hated life, and he was abused. He was bullied at school, and so he thought he'd take it out on Trump one day, got himself a rifle, and somehow with a ladder and a rifle, nobody saw him, and he gets up there, and then everybody sees him. They tell the Secret Service. The Secret Service doesn't do anything about it, and he gets off these fantastic shots, which almost killed President Trump. That's the official story. The secondary story, which people are already digging into, is he had help. 1, 2, there were multiple shooters. 3, the Secret Service acted in very unusual ways. But underneath that, we're already seeing the junk conspiracy arise. And this is the third force narratives that come out. Now, these narratives are put out by the same people who are putting out the regular. They want you to go back to the official one because the other one's going to get so crazy. And one of these came out today and saying that this woman who was behind Trump and had these sunglasses on, that she reacted in too straight a fashion to not be some official who knew what was going to happen or whatever. And then they identified her as some assistant director of the FBI. And then a few hours later, that was completely debunked. And so this is to show how irresponsible, just the kind of blogosphere can be about all these things. And they were able to prove that, make that point. This is why the filter for junk conspiracy has to be particularly high in an incident like this. And I don't think people should be going over a cliff, for example, saying that the Secret Service director is involved in it. No, but obviously there's manipulation in the Secret Service to allow a gunman to be able to scale the building and sit on top of it to shoot at the president. Now, was he even the one who got the shots off at the president? These are some other very good questions. We're going to get into these tonight. We're going to do about 90 minutes with you here on this special report. And I'm going to try to cover the incident and also the arc of history that gives us some patterns and templates of the incident as we go forward here in this season of deep state assassination, as it were. And you saw with the Slovakian president as well, Fico, that he, this is a guy who also survived an assassination attempt recently. So these things do tend to come in waves, and I'm going to talk about how that wave operates. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Deep State Assassination Executive Action Directive. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. You can ask Miss Olivia those questions now, and she'll be putting them together before I go any further. Miss Olivia, what do you got out there?
Maddie Mosef says the building where Matthew Crooks took the shots had a connection to aerospace. The company is called American Glass Research. My ears perked at that after listening to DJ REJFK. And Joseph Tuga says BlackRock is undoubtedly plugged into the secret space program.
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, here's some pieces of this that aren't junk conspiracy at all. One, Crooks was definitely in a BlackRock commercial. Now, that could have been random, sure. It's just unusual considering the activities around BlackRock that we've seen. And also, I always think of this in them scanning these places, figuring out who they can use either for intel purposes or to use as a patsy. And I have to say, after looking at Crooks, and I know a lot more is going to come out about him, but he is a very ideal patsy. He seems to be kind of emotionally undeveloped and be socially awkward, and also highly intelligent. So that's a combination which has, got us people like Lee Harvey Oswald, Mark David Chapman, John Hinckley Jr., and others. And he certainly fills that bill. And when you think about them filming this commercial with him at his school just a year before all this took place, you do wonder exactly the types of things that they did with this young man to put him in that position on the roof. Now, one of the things I think that shows that the incident was not as it's been portrayed and was organized from another set of authorities is the fact that the police engaged the shooter before the Secret Service shot at him, before he shot any bullets. And the way that story goes, it comes from two local policemen, and they say people in the crowd, and we have the films of people in the crowd saying he's up there. And he did things, Crook did things to make himself visible. There's no doubt about it. He walked around. I even think he wanted himself to be seen on that roof. Part of whatever his programming was, and certainly there are overtures to MK Ultra in this situation. I don't think you can get around it. And no way. This guy was programmed to be up there and to be visible. So, because there's no way that somebody's going to be that visible. If you flash back to Lee Harvey Oswald and the assassination, you'll find 3 separate witnesses seeing somebody up there on the 6th floor with a rifle out the window before the motorcade comes around. So they wanted this idea to be out there. It wasn't Oswald up there doing it, obviously. He's downstairs having lunch in the 2nd floor lunchroom. But the fact that he works in the building, the fact that he defected to the Soviet Union, he's going to be the perfect patsy. Well, this guy also has to do things. They're telling him, look, walk around the crowd, with a duffel bag that looks like it has a rifle in it, do things to make sure it's obvious. One of the things that they did in the case of Oswald, and some of these are going to come out, I'm sure, with the Crooks situation, is they would have Oswald go into, a car dealership, or he went into a rifle place and said, I need this scope by Friday. Can you make sure you have it? And they would say, what's your name? And he would give his whole name, Lee Harvey Oswald. Well, he could have called himself John Smith and they wouldn't have had any trail of that. So whoever was going in there and impersonating him wanted this thread of this guy walking around getting ready to do this assassination. And one of the things that was an overlap that I was absolutely stunned by was this guy Crooks going to a shooting range a few days before and saying, I really need to get this target down. And they have all this witness testimony of him being at a shooting range. Well, that's exactly what they did with Lee Harvey Oswald. And as a matter of fact, with the person that they sent in to be Oswald, they had him shooting at somebody else's target. And when the person got, miffed that he was shooting at their target, they said, hey, buddy, what are you doing? And Kennedy, Oswald looked at it and said, oh, I thought I was shooting at that SOB Kennedy, and, my name's Lee Harvey Oswald, by the way. This is my address. So we have to get into how those things operate. And I'm going to show you an actual assassination manual from the CIA that they were using in the 1950s, and how this thing, I've tracked the different assassination programs that they've had over the decades. And it's remarkable because assassination as a tool If you go back to, right after the First World War in post-war Germany, before the Second World War, in the setup to that Nazi leadership, they had so many assassinations of various local officials that they needed to just bump off and get out of the way, that this became part of just how it was done. In World War One, of course, it's an assassination. Supposedly, that sets off the whole thing. Well, they had the war all cooked up. They just needed the trigger for it. So we find ourselves with a legacy of assassination. And I think that those tools became so Americanized that the American intelligence apparatus, which had gone abroad to do all these things in the name of fighting communism and everything else, decided we can use those same tools here in our own country for doing these things. So that's how we got these programs so loaded up. And I'm going to read you some of the names of the programs. And it's fun whenever you look at what the CIA was doing early on, and there's a lot of codes and how the CIA ran things. They would always use the term PB. So I'm going to nickname this assassination attempt PB Overthrow, and I'm going to show you how it plays into their template. And again, where was the CIA in all this? By the way, if they're raising the fact that they were tracking an intelligence threat that Iran was going to assassinate President Kennedy, they would have had CIA agents in the crowd. So what about those guys? Even the director of the CIA, the assistant director in the Kennedy situation, when he came out in the 90s, gave all this testimony. He said, I was searching to see if we had any members in the crowd there in Dallas because it would have been good. They would have, known what was going on. And he tripped himself up because everyone was saying, why would you have agents, CIA agents in the crowd? So, and that's kind of one of the priceless moments there when you're looking at this history. But we have to understand the way that the groups that organize assassination operate in order to get to the bottom of what's happening here. It's going to be very easy for people to go over a cliff and point at this politician or this director or whatever and say they did it or whatever, and just like with the FBI woman today, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to turn up the heat on these low-level officials through junk conspiracy, thereby proving that, this whole kind of blogosphere analyzing this is never going to be as trusted as those media authorities. This is a very important thing to avoid, especially since they're going to be the ones that are putting and kind of like the fish on the hook, those things out there so that everyone on Twitter, to get their clickbait says, hey, it was this FBI woman that was behind Trump. So I think a lot of caution in relation to the things that people are sharing. Yes, Miss Olivia.
CR user says, I taught high school/computer lab instruction. I had students get, quote, recruited by 3-letter agencies, cults, etc. I tried to alert administrators. Now it's more well known.
Yes.
And BW says they've been saying Crooks was, quote, non-political and trudging out people who knew him to say this, but multiple witnesses have disputed this idea. One kid says he was very anti-Trump.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's true. There are also people who say that he registered as a Republican to vote. So that's on the record, but he also gave money to Act Blue or some of these things. I would say it's too preliminary to know what they have. And certainly some of what they put out is going to be manipulated. So the nearest we're going to get to the truth is maybe what neighbors have to say in relation to him. What's odd is that neighbors around his house say that whenever they went by that house, they didn't see anybody in there. So, as I said, the whole thing's going to feel very Twilight Zone as we go along. But I think there's a way to get to some root facts, and that's what we're going to be doing tonight. I want to remind everyone, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. It's a free newsletter, and it lets you know about the incredible shows that we have coming up for you, X-Series episodes, interviews, and some very interesting specials that we'll be doing along with documentaries and events and things. It's all there in the newsletter. So stand up and be counted. Make sure you're there in the newsletter. We've been suffering dramatic, and I mean truly dramatic censorship, and in an election year in particular, I think it's savage. Now, here's a funny thing that you can do, and I want everyone in the ideas room to do this tonight. Right underneath the video tonight here and in all my videos, there's a hashtag of the subject of the show, which would be like, JFK. And it also says Dark Journalist. But when you click on the hashtag for Dark Journalist, it says nothing to see here. Well, there's over 510 videos on this channel alone. Never mind anywhere else. Okay. But if you press anything else, all of that stuff comes up. So this is the level of censorship that they're doing. And it's not just with me, but it's a blanket activity and it affects us dramatically. I will say the censorship has been particularly heavy in relation to this program, to the website, to the newsletter, and everything. But I've found that the newsletter is, in fact, the best way for us to keep in touch. And I would say in a period like this, it would be absolutely crucial. So make sure you stand up and be counted. And that's a free newsletter. It comes to you once a week on Friday, just to let you know what exciting shows we have coming up for you. Yes.
Okay. Graphics Nut says, I've signed up for the newsletter 3 times, but I never get one. So if that happens, because I'm sure there's other people that have this experience, who should they reach out to?
Oh, it's easy. Just send your email address to admin@darkjournalist.com and it'll just put you in there manually. So the thing is, too, little things like that will always happen. But I think the real kind of across the board censorship, I've always heard people play the victim with censorship and all the rest of it. But I will say this, I don't like to mention it, but it's such a factor that I think, so we understand that real pipeline is from the email newsletter to you. That goes right in your inbox. That's kind of like the best thing because the social media networks, like we saw with the CrowdStrike thing today, and all the people in the coffee shops having to write labels and stuff. I had a woman in a grocery store have to write out my entire bill. It was hilarious. And it was funny. I was thinking people walking around in a daze, and I've mentioned this to Olivia, that I think the whole thing about the Trump assassination up here in Boston, it is, for some reason, they're blocking off how people can absorb it. And so you don't even hear people talking about it. It's bizarre. And I had this experience of seeing all these people walk around with that little white Bluetooth thing in their ear, walking around in space. And this one guy I saw, he was going off on his little, conversation there. And he walked into a bike and I heard the guy say, sorry to the bike. And I thought, boy, we really are in the twilight zone here. And, people are just lifting up into this dream space. And we need more and more awareness, sort of situational awareness around us because that was something.
I bet.
I always take note of it too, because, I don't judge people for being in, trying to kind of tune out to something else. But at the same time, I don't think it's a particularly healthy environment to do that. I guess if we were in a different time, in a different place, it probably would be just fine. Okay. A couple of other things about Crooks, including, we've seen some weird things in his bio already. And again, this is very preliminary because we haven't even had the full briefing of the Secret Service. The FBI hasn't briefed anybody, and they're doing, the entire thing. They haven't briefed the press at all, which is strange. This is tomorrow. It'll be a week later, and nothing from the FBI. It's quite unusual.
It's offensive, really, when you think about it.
There's no question about it, and I think it shows that they're already engaged on the FBI side, some high level covering up. And I think there's a reason for that also, which is, again, you don't have to go and say this person in the FBI or that person in the Secret Service is involved. It's the apparatus that is protecting the institution. And that's why you have dark journalism in the beginning, which is, this is what it's meant to penetrate through. And this is the kind of thing where it's going to be on public display. It's in everyone's face at this point. The other thing that we need to consider is those who plotted the assassination didn't succeed. So,
so now what?
Yeah. So they try to take that leader out and they missed. This is dramatic. And I think there's also a pattern here when we look at the Kennedy assassination in Chicago. They missed. In Florida, they missed. In Dallas, bingo, they were on target. So how far does the contract extend? And those tentacles that are involved. So, certainly with the security beefed up after the first assassination attempt, things are going to be different. So, it's going to be much more difficult to get at Trump. But I think that we're in this season of assassination with it here, and it has to be a factor. I also hear people, and I heard this from Tucker Carlson during the Republican convention, and he said, nothing's going to stop Trump now. He's already got the election. I don't want to hear any talk like that at all. This is not going to be a cakewalk. The people involved have proven themselves. The deep state are absolutely vicious. They'll do anything to get their way. So there's no way you could just say, oh, Trump's in there. He's got it. He is winning. There's no question about it. And, everyone's seen the Biden fail. They've exposed it. And they've tried to kind of maybe co-opt into the Trump thing and be like, the media in the middle of all this is sort of being like, maybe they can somehow twist the fact that Trump's up there and be the opposition party. This is very interesting. We have to really dig through this a little bit to see what's going on, because the factor of the attempt and then Biden and people coming out with Harris and being like, oh, this is a terrible thing that happened. Of course, they're going to say that. And again, I don't think the Biden administration is behind the assassination, interestingly enough. I think the forces in that administration who want to keep this president, Stepford Biden, there taking their orders, they want to continue this. They want to hold the presidency. The presidency is the most important office in the entire world. We have to get that clear. And when I hear, it's one of the most foolish things I hear around independent media, which is, throw away your vote, walk away from the process, whatever it happens to be. No, absolutely not. That's totally wrong. And I hear it sometimes from, older people who I respect and I've talked to and even had on the show, but they're completely wrong. And, that I've stressed this before, that you're looking at a body politic, and the head of that unit is the presidency. The presidency is such an important office. There's so many things that can flow from that office that if you can't get that right, everything that you have downstream from that is going to have problems. Also, there's the incredible power of the veto and other things that the president has. No, it's an incredible office with incredible authority, and we need to have people who respect the Constitution in it. And I think in the case of Trump, look, again, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, because even if you are not in favor of Trump, whatever it happens to be, Trump proved during his own administration that he respected things like the Constitution, the Second Amendment, the border, and would stop the invasion of the border. And again, I feel like the invasion of the border is probably the number one issue that we have in this country, because if you flood the resources of the United States and you destroy the cities, you won't have a country left. I think that's pretty apparent. Okay, let's move back to Crooks. Some things that don't add up. The spectacle, the kind of like, circus performer, here I am, everybody look at me. That doesn't add up with the story that they're putting out there, because in a normal situation, the Secret Service would have grabbed this guy. We know the Secret Service a half hour before the shooting had identified him. One, supposedly lost track of him. That's ridiculous. Okay, it's not a very big environment. They're the Secret Service. They can instantly corral the resources to find someone that they're not seeing. So that doesn't make any sense. They have
They
people
could have also just pulled him aside and detained him at any point.
Oh, yes.
They need to just let him roam.
Exactly. Well, I'll tell you how obvious this gets. First of all, this is a shot, I'm sure everyone's seen it, who's been following the case, of Crooks on the roof that he shot at President Trump. And by the way, the bullet was so close to Trump's head that, basically we're talking about, if he hadn't turned his head, it was basically less than an inch away that this bullet went by, and it nicked his ear as we saw all the blood come out. So he was very nearly successful, MK Ultra sitting up there, whether he's the shooter or not. The assassination attempt was nearly successful. But look how obvious this is. This is absurd for Secret Service, even for local police. You're not going to have anyone up there with a rifle. This is what these guys train for. They train in these situations all the time. All the excuses don't add up. And of course, in the case of other assassination attempts where this has happened, We've also had strange compromises around the Secret Service. So there does seem to be something fundamental that can be activated to get the Secret Service off its game. In this case, they needed it badly and they got it, but they didn't get it enough so that they were successful in assassinating Trump. A couple of things about Crooks. So he's from Bethel Park, where very close by to Butler. And what's interesting is his background, the things that we hear about him. The guy had a weird social footprint. It doesn't look like he had a lot on social media, which is odd for one of these computer guys. So this is an unusual thing. His dad and his mother were counselors, and they both had, all these weapons, but like hunting situations. One of the things that he was picked on at school was for showing up in hunting gear. And yet he is also seems to be into these Democrat causes. So that's also kind of interesting. The fact, and I want to reiterate this is on the record, he'd been accepted into Robert Morris University and planned to attend it. So RMU in Moon, I think, is an interesting sort of shadow over this whole thing. And I would say the official record, we don't have enough on Crooks yet that they've released for us to get any of the types of details that would be helpful, except that he supposedly was using an AR-15. By the way, how do you walk around with an AR-15 and a ladder and not get spotted? Now, a little piece of news came out just before we started tonight. This is quite remarkable, that the Trump gunman, Crooks, flew a drone over the rally site hours before the attempted assassination. What Secret Service setup would allow a guy to be flying a drone? That's the most obvious thing that you would have an assassin doing. So there's no way. The Secret Service stood down, and as I said, they took the regular guys and they said, "Oh, they're tired. Don't worry. We'll have all these Homeland Security agents fill in for you." This is the same Homeland Security now that didn't provide any Secret Service to presidential candidate Bobby Kennedy Jr. And that was a very dangerous situation that they let linger. And then Mayorkas stumbled up to the microphone after all this and finally granted him Secret Service. Well, thanks a lot. Yeah, after the assassination attempt. The gunman, this is Wall Street Journal now, the gunman who tried to kill Donald Trump was able to fly a drone and get aerial footage of Western Pennsylvania, the fairgrounds where the rally was held, shortly before the former president was set to speak there. It just, this is one of the most insane things. So they're going to have some kind of house cleaning there at the Secret Service. But the problem must go a lot deeper, because you're not just dealing with Secret Service. And but they would be the principal ones in charge technically, which is why there must have been some operational force in there that is not being admitted to. And my guess is that there's a central intelligence factor going on here, because they're the only ones who could say, "Hey, we're keeping an eye on this for, we're watching for an Iranian team or whatever," because how else could you get the Secret Service to stand down so dramatically? So there's some factor, I believe, is going to come out that's going to show some other intelligence group was shutting people down. And again, when that process goes, when you take, for example, when they took the two Secret Service agents off the back of the limousine, it's very unusual in the President Kennedy's case. You don't do that. And as a matter of fact, through most of the motorcade, you will see him in different cities, and he always has the guys in the back. When you get to the Dealey Plaza shooting, they take the guys off the back, because if you're shooting at him from multiple angles, you don't want them in the way, because you can't, just like they didn't shoot Jackie Kennedy in the middle of all this. You're supposed to get the target, and that's it. I think in the case of hitting Connolly, it was a big goof up there. And so there's a lot of layers to how we need to look at this, and I'm going to bring that in as well, but a little more from this article. So law enforcement officials briefed on the matter said that they were further underscoring the stunning security lapses ahead of Trump's near assassination. So everybody, the media is on board with this, that there was a gigantic security lapse. And what they're going to say is, oh, it was an oversight, or whatever. It doesn't work that way. These guys are trained in situations, just like the people in COG are trained for nuclear war. The Secret Service is trained to pull out machine guns and kill people. I mean, that's what their job is, for protection. So they will do that. The idea that they saw this guy with a rifle, and they had reports that the police had engaged this guy, and the radio that the police put the report out on, of course, the Secret Service had access to. They heard it. Hey, we've got this guy on a roof. He's got a rifle. He pointed it at us. We jumped off the roof. They didn't do anything. So they're being instructed somewhere not to do it. This is the nature and the heart of the cover-up there. But whoever is performing that, again, has such a level of power and such a level of invisibility that it's going to be very hard to get at where those instructions were from. And they might clear out the entire Secret Service leadership trying to find that. Because, again, this is a very old system. And whoever was running that, who wanted to run the interference on the protection aspect, they were in the corner of the assassins, of the conspirators in this case. There's no way to get around it. This is a problem, too, because you have all these different situations happening. Let's do something in the lead up to the assassination. What were we looking for? Well, what were we looking at? Julian Assange had just been released. Well, this is unusual. In an election situation. There was, if you go a little bit further back, you're going to find an unusual dinner that Gavin Newsom and the Clintons are having. And when I looked at that, I said to myself, they could be just saying hello. But for me, the Clintons knew that Biden was going to stumble. Here's another strange thing. Biden, who, would ordinarily debate Trump, if you ever looked at the records of the different debates for the presidential candidates, they're always in September and October. That's all there is to it. Vice presidential and presidential. It's only primary candidates who face off against each other in off months leading up to it. All the debates take place after the convention because you coronate the nominee, and then they go into battle in the fall in the campaign. Unusually, the Biden campaign asked the Trump campaign to do the horrible debate that Biden did on June 27th. Well, that never happens. So somebody was already arranging things on this board for Biden to stumble and for this whole scenario to play out. And in the middle of all that, they release Assange. One of the things that was unusual about people who watch things around WikiLeaks and the Assange case and his long imprisonment and the intel games that go on in relation to this, I'm talking all the way into the Seth Rich situation and all of these different factors that make Assange such a high value target, that the Central Intelligence Agency, who everyone is trying to tell you, hey, they're wonderful now. They're not the brutal assassins that they used to be. They're great guys. They'll give you UFO disclosure, for heaven's sake. There's a whole plan that came out that the Central Intelligence Agency had set up an assassination plan for Assange in London. And if you go through some of the things when he was staying at this embassy for protection, and they had people scaling the wall and things like that. Well, CIA agents got busted in cars outside of there, spotting him, looking at him, looking for ways to assassinate him. So the CIA is definitely in the assassination business still. I don't know who ever suggested that they were out of it. Everyone knows that they're in the assassination business. Therefore, when you look at the heart of an assassination attempt like this, where's the CIA? That's the question that we need to be asking. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Deep State Assassination Executive Action Directive, and it's all about the tragic events that would have been a lot more tragic. But of course, there was life lost in the crowd at the Butler, Pennsylvania field there with President Trump and his campaign event, and that incredible turn to show this chart about illegal aliens coming into the country saved his life. And it was close. It was real close. And so I think we're all grateful that it turned out as it did. But now I think in that kind of autopsy of the situation, we need to take a deep look at the factor of the deep state rising here and the forces that are involved who are trying to keep Stepford Biden and his ilk in office. And again, I can't stress to you the amount of when I hear it, when people get into this thing about, Tucker Carlson and other people saying Trump's in, he's got it, man, he's gold now, everything's fine, he's winning, it's going to be a landslide and all that. If I could have a blowhorn, I would just tell them to shut up, because this is not going to be a cakewalk. And once you get to Labor Day, typically the campaign kicks off. So yeah, there's a dramatic narrative shift that's taken place, and even the media can't help but see the courageous way in which President Trump dealt with the assassination attempt and how they failed. The deep state behind this administration failed. And yet, the idea that suddenly everything's going to be roses and he's in the White House already doesn't work that way. One, you have the election to get through, then you have the period when he is not yet president, when he's president elect, and that goes from November 5th to January 20th. So there's all sorts of weirdness in the middle of all this. It's not going to be a cakewalk, and it needs to be very, very carefully gone after, and it needs to be very well organized. And, just a bunch of, kind of bluster over the facts is not good at all. Although I think people can see that the Republican convention went really smoothly. It went really well, and it was well organized, and that Trump is a true hero for the fact that he could show up after an assassination attempt, after they tried to blow his head off, and, show up there and be there in the stands and then give a speech. And I don't think anyone would be honest not saying that he was shaken up genuinely. And what's really interesting is that there's an illness, of course, in the MSNBC style media, and they were trying to get this narrative going about, oh, it's this was somehow Trump's fault, or then underneath that was, oh, it was staged. And this is interesting because we understand the false flag now in our regular society. And the false flags go back all the way to the Reichstag fire and way beyond that, the Maine and everything else. And of course, the incidents that got us into Vietnam and all the rest. But the idea is that something happens and that is caused by one side as a provocation for war or for some other situation. And so now they've realized, okay, people understand false flags. We're going to float junk conspiracy through our own ranks, and sort of turn the conspiracy narrative for people who just hate Trump, and we'll work it this way. I want to point this out in relation to Trump as well, that Trump, I've put this forward on this program on a number of occasions. It has to be understood the level that he operates is not just as a political figure or loudmouth celebrity, apprentice, TV personality, or real estate mogul. Trump, when it was interesting when they were showing during the Republican convention in the lead up, the kind of life of Trump, this film they put together, one of the things they showed him looking at was the Twin Towers. And I thought that was interesting. But another thing that they showed was his picture with Roy Cohn.
Yep.
This is dramatic because this is Trump signaling again, like Roy Cohn showed me where all the bodies were buried in the deep state, basically. Of course, Cohn knew. He went all the way back to the McCarthy hearings. And he was one of the biggest players in that kind of deep state swamp. And he had taken a liking to and been a mentor politically to President Trump. And Trump was in that milieu of being a casino owner, hotel owner, that he would mix with those deep state elements around organized crime. And so Cohn was that interface, but Cohn was an interface between intel, organized crime, and aerospace. This is the factor that is left out very often. And if you can go in and look at figures like Roy Cohn, look at figures in history through this lens, then we're going to get a much better picture of who we're dealing with, because the aerospace aspect is absolutely crucial. And one of the greatest accomplishments, I guess you could say, about Trump when he was in office was creating the Space Force with almost no opposition. It was quite remarkable. Very often, you hear all kinds of opposition to these things. Space Force, he had it down pat. And one of the things that he was doing there was pulling that exotic technology wing, the UFO file, back under executive control, where it had fallen out into intel control back as far as the Eisenhower era. This is a deep problem in the structural aspect of the geopolitical life of America. And therefore, I think if we look through that lens, if we understand that, we'll get a better picture of it. Because, of course, they could oppose Trump on his China policy, his Middle East policy, the fact that he's America first, he's more nationalist than empire building, doesn't want to go around conquering Russia and places like that, the way the neocons who took over the Liberal Party of the Democrats, they're just obsessed with it. This is what they want to do. They've decided they're going to reduce the world's population. They're going to get rid of Russia. They're going to do all these other things. So it is true that Trump is so opposite from them in that department. But Trump, when he sits down at the table with them, through the knowledge of his uncle, who was very well versed in exotic technology, through Vannevar Bush, as we've revealed in this program, and also through the figure of Roy Cohn, who showed him the roadmap for the deep state. And then finally, through his deep relationship that we revealed on this program with Richard Nixon, which eventually, after we revealed it 2 years later, the Nixon Museum said, yeah, they did. You know what? We have 387 letters between these guys. Well, before they only said there was one. So, look at Tesla, Trump, and the time capsule. I think we put that out 2018 or something like that. It just shows you that these things are there. So if you look at it, even if you're this lone outpost like we are over here, if you put that kind of truth pedal to the metal, you will get the results from it. And I think that's a crucial thing. So when Trump sits down and he's organizing things, or if he wants a summit with Putin or whatever, the deep state and the intel agencies that surround that deep state and are part of it. This is another thing I want to point out. And I heard a guy who's a very intelligent guy, and I like his work generally. And I've said this about a few people. So it's not to insult them, but we have to get this straight. When people talk about the deep state, this was Edward Dowd talking about the deep state. And he was saying, oh, there are bureaucrats there in government who just continue to work in government between administrations. That's the deep state. No, it's nothing to do with that. Whitney Webb has said the same thing. She doesn't even use the term in her own research. She doesn't think a deep state exists. There's a problem in the fundamental understanding of what the deep state is and who identified it. It was Peter Dale Scott. Well, Peter Dale Scott spent 5 decades doing the complete dissection of this. He understands it well, and I think that these people, when they go into this, they're trying to understand a much larger picture. They have to use the foundation of Professor Scott. I have. And I've never come out and said, well, my observations of the deep state are just based on my own observations. They're based on the fundamental foundation of the deep state work that Professor Scott did. He was the one who went in and got the facts. So he wrote about COG in the 1980s. This is how we'll understand it. People use COG as a punchline now. Do you know how important this office is, the continuity of government? That whole piece of Northcom running America, you're that close. Last Saturday, you got that close to COG running the entire picture. And the idea in COG, it's very simple. Anyone can look this up. If you have a situation which is declared an emergency, you have the Northcom commander, who is Greg Gillett, who is also in charge of NORAD, who is also the COG combatant commander. He becomes the leader of the entire United States. And what does he do? He selects regional governors for the East Coast, for the Midwest, and all the rest. No more Congress, nothing like that. Just regional governors run things. And these are the circumstances that were built up by a very small group, by the way. And Dick Cheney was involved in it. And when you see Liz Cheney out there, shooting her mouth off about how they should get rid of Trump and all the rest, it's interesting because that is the representative of that COG contingent in public. And why does the press even pay attention to her? That is a person who held a Republican seat in Congress and lost. Her opponent got 61% of the vote. So she was thrown out of Congress. The only thing that she had going for her was that she was anti-Trump and she was a Republican. Well, that Bush-Cheney piece doesn't like Trump. We have to ask ourselves why when you're in the middle of all this. So I'll go back to these Dowd comments. Dowd has so much information in relation to COVID and all the rest of it. And financially, he paints such an incredible picture. He even understands the UFO threat, which he's thrown into his interviews here and there. And, I'll talk to the guy at some point. He's a very smart guy. But I have seen this before where the deep state gets overshadowed as just, oh, hey, it's these guys that are hanging out and bureaucrats in between. No, it has nothing to do with that. As a matter of fact, the deep state, as described by Professor Scott on this program and to me in conversation many, many times, works something like this. The deep state on the very bottom rung has an organized crime connection. And then above that are the intelligence agencies, the Central Intelligence Agency, the NSA, the NRO. And then interwoven with that are the contracting agencies who are even further outside the law and less accountable than the actual agency. So Booz Allen Hamilton can, be instructed by the CIA, hey, we need you to do some things that we can't do. We need you to go into this place and, suit up and act like you're an assassin and go over here and cause some commotion by this water tower so everyone will run over there and look for it. These are the types of things that those types of people can do. As you move up in that chain, you get into the incredible wealth of the oil companies, the tech oligarchs, and others, and then the management of that wealth. This system operating there in concert with the continuity of government group, that comprises the deep state. They're not, motor vehicle employees. This is the idea of bureaucrats just hanging out in government, and that's some deep state. I don't know where that even came in. I think it was some people in Fox News didn't understand it, and they put that as the meme of what the deep state is. And I'll tell you, it's so far off the bat. And then you have people who are on the left now who think that using the deep state is some kind of right-wing whistle. So that's ridiculous because Professor Scott, who invented the term, is the most left-wing Berkeley professor you can imagine. And he's a fantastic guy, clearly on the left, the original hardcore, deep left. So we need to get something straight there. When you have these people talking about the deep state, they need to understand what they're talking about. And the best way to do that is to go directly to the work of Professor Scott, who unearthed the deep state in 5 decades of research. And you might have variations on how people view it, but this idea of, these kind of career employees of the government, this has nothing to do with anything, and they would just be, you have to think of the deep state, as Professor Scott has told me many times, think of the deep state as a system that comes in like a weather system, like a tornado. It causes all this destruction. No one exactly knows where it comes from. And then with withdraws, you see all of the wreckage from what they did. But somewhere in the middle of all this, there's been a policy change. There was something else that was very crucial about Scott's description in this. And again, Scott deals strictly with the government aspects and the secret government aspects, the overworld and the underworld. This is the way that he puts it. He's not dealing with the UFO file or anything like that. And I've mentioned this thing in general, that people who deal with the UFO file don't deal with the deep state aspect. And it's understandable because the UFO community acts like in a very circus style fashion, so you have that split. But one of the things that Professor Scott has pointed out that I think is very crucial is that in the middle of all these deep events that happen, and certainly the assassination attempt against Trump last week was a deep event, you always have continuity of government personnel involved. 9/11, the financial coup d'etat of 2008, Watergate, Iran-Contra, the continuity of government setup, the activation of the continuity of government, the Patriot Act. There's always continuity of government players involved. The Kennedy assassination. I pointed this out that Winston Lawson, the Secret Service agent who set up the trip, along with the mayor of Dallas, operated using what they call the Doomsday Network, which is the network that you would use in the event of a nuclear attack. And the reason that they would use something like that is because there's no trace. So nobody can go back and say, you made this and this call and whatever. It's a completely secret communications network. And it operates in such a secret fashion that even the people in Congress don't know what's going on. So this aspect of us getting a handle on what the deep state is and what COG is very important. And I see that there's a lot of things coming into regular parlance as the rise of this independent media and the kind of pseudo-independent media that goes along with it is coming into the fore. The only thing that I would suggest in relation to all this, and like I said, the people I've mentioned have great things to offer. I'm just pointing out that this interpretation of the deep state aspect is something that is totally wrong. So we need to get that one straight. And the only reason that I know that is because I can go right to the horse's mouth of the guy who coined it in the first place. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is deep state assassination, executive action, directive, and it goes right to the heart of this incredible event of last Saturday where they were that close to removing the next president of the United States and the former president of the United States and the leading Republican candidate in opposition to the Biden regime. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. I have a few more things to put on the record about Crooks, Oswald, and the template, as it were, along with the assassination template that the CIA uses, which some of the things we have on record because they've left their footprints in their overthrows and in other situations. We're going to be taking your questions. And also, I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our free newsletter. It keeps us in touch and it lets you know about the exciting documentaries, X-series episodes, and wonderful interviews that we have coming up for you this summer. And also exciting events and just incredible things all there for you for free in your email newsletter. Okay, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Okay, Dardy says, does a faction of deep state hate Trump because they do not have a controlled dossier on him, but another faction has leverage because they bailed him out of his casino bankruptcy?
Well, I think he was able to survive any kind of blackmail attempts. I'm sure anyone in business has something that can be blackmailed. And, so he was able to, probably with the help of Roy Cohn, insulate himself. I want to tell you about a story about Roy Cohn to give us some idea. So there was someone who was an aide to Cohn who was in trouble. And because of the trouble, he was going to be deported. And Cohn said, I want you to show up at 10 o'clock in the morning at this Los Angeles County courthouse. I want you to go in there and I want you to identify yourself as a material witness in this particular crime. The guy said, what do you mean? What crime? What are you talking about? He said, just go and do it. And, report back to me immediately afterwards. So the aide goes the next day, shows up at this LA County courthouse in a case he's never heard of, with a judge he's never heard of, none of it, anything, and says, I can help you as a material witness in this case. And the judge says, oh, let's make sure that we record your name, the legal process. They have him go through this kind of paperwork type thing. He goes back home to New York. 2 days later, he gets a message from the legal system of New York saying, we're not going to, the fact that you are involved in this other case, you're not going to be deported, and any proceedings like that will be held off for 3 years for you. This is the kind of leverage and power that Cohn had at the drop of a hat to be able to manipulate somebody's status in the country, for example, and use some very unusual techniques in order to do it. The guy never had to turn up or do anything with the material case. Just the fact that he was listed meant you're home free. So we have to see and understand how that type of power works. And then think, Roy Cohn is the man who helped Trump get the power to build Trump Tower and be such a powerhouse there in New York. So that level of knowledge, and you can't really defend Cohn's character. I've called him really kind of the chief swamp of the deep state, but he had survival instincts that were phenomenal because, he was sort of like the king of the rats, as it were. So he understood all of their different, really where all the trip hammers were. And that helped him to be an incredible asset to Trump on his way up. And I would say in that system of New York versus DC, again, we have to understand certain things about cities in America that we don't understand, power centers. And so when you talk about Chicago and you talk about Los Angeles and you talk about New York City and you talk about DC and Boston, you're talking about different centers of power. And that goes for Miami and other places too. So when you see Trump and he's coming into this situation, although he appeals to all these different states that are conservative and everything else, he comes out of New York City. He comes out of the milieu of New York City. He'd almost spent no time in DC at all before he became president. Think about that, and we'll get some handle on who we're really dealing with there. He represents New York. And New York, remember, was the center at which, for example, Sullivan and Cromwell, who starts the CIA, that's New York. It's a New York law firm. It's the highest end New York law firm. And what is it that they do? International finance. So it's not even military, but they're the ones who draft everything about the Central Intelligence Agency. High-end lawyers who deal in international finance. So we need to understand the way the intelligence aspect works as the foundation of all this. We get a better picture of it. I think if we think of it that way, and we think of these cities and the powers that these cities hold, and then we identify different people with the cities that they represent, and in the case of Biden, certainly DC and all the rest of it. But Trump really is coming in as a reclaiming of power for New York. And I think it had been tried a few times, but FDR was the main power center originally as the governor of New York. Let's not forget that. Okay. A couple of things. I wanted to get these comments by Josh Hawley on the record in relation to the Secret Service, because I think they're going to be important later. And then I'm going to read the comparison of Crooks with Oswald, and then we're going to go to your questions. Okay, fantastic. Of course, the iconic shot there of Trump coming out of this incident and raising his fist and saying, "Fight." It's remarkable, but I think even in this case, the Secret Service ordinarily would be moving him along. So something unusual, even in this, I would say. But I think it does show some of the courage of the man involved, and I think even his enemies would have to give him tremendous credit there, and some of them have. Now, one of the things that was found with Crooks was a transmitter. And the transmitter was supposed to set off these explosives that were in a van that was parked close by outside this guy's house, who had never seen him or the van. And the guy noticed it when we went in the house, and he's been on like ABC and NBC giving interviews. There's a few strange things in relation to that, in that the van had Arizona plates. This hasn't been explained very well. So here's a couple of things about Crooks. He's walking in, he's flying drones before the event, right? Should have been grabbed right there. Next, he's parking a van in front of this guy's house with Arizona plates. Next, he's driving around in a Hyundai. And so, where he's getting the ability to travel around, obviously he's being assisted and moved into position. Then he's carrying an AR-15 and a ladder up to this building, uses it to get up there, and then hopping across buildings in full view so people can see him. And as I said, the most extraordinary piece of the entire puzzle for me is the police, they go up to this building. They say, oh, people have pointed up. There's a guy up there. Oh, yeah, we can see someone up there. Can't actually get a good shot at him. We're going to stand on each other's shoulders. And the guy does it. He stands on his shoulders in true cop fashion that we've seen in all these cop shows over the years.
Starsky Hutch.
And he looks across the roof and he sees Crooks, and Crooks sees him, and Crooks turns around with the rifle like he's about to shoot him. The cop jumps off, hits the radio. There's a guy up there. Let's get him. You got Secret Service, you got cops, do it. Nothing happens. Now, the exact amount of time between that incident and this guy shooting at President Trump and almost being successful in shooting him in the head, it looks like there's a gap of time there, like solid length of time. They haven't quoted the actual amount of time between him doing that, but think of him. He has to point at the cop drops, gets on the radio. This guy has to get himself back into position, look through the scope, make sure he's got Trump in his sights, and shoot him. None of that adds up. It just doesn't. And so the Secret Service leadership is not going to be able to explain it. That's my prediction, because the group that was operating through the security apparatus of Homeland Security and the Secret Service is invisible. It is completely invisible, and it only works through certain individuals, and they are not going to incriminate themselves. So now let's go to Josh Hawley. Majority of Trump's security detail were not Secret Service, whistleblowers tell Senator Hawley. Whistleblowers allegedly claimed that the majority of security personnel at the Butler, Pennsylvania rally were Homeland Security Investigations agents. This is absolutely crucial because you needed the Homeland Security piece, not the Secret Service piece. You needed enough of the Secret Service overlap to be able to create this situation, but it's the Homeland Security people who can inevitably take these orders, not to protect the client, president. Now, Hawley, who's the Republican senator from Missouri, he says, whistleblowers who have direct knowledge of the event have approached my office. According to the allegations, the July 13th rally was considered to be a loose security event. Hawley wrote in the letter, for example, detection canines were not used to monitor entry and detect threats in the usual manner. So now we have, a lot of unusual things. So they're not protecting ruse, but now they're also not using canine dogs, which means somebody is also trying to make them vulnerable to explosives. And we know there is a transmitter there with Crooks and explosives in his van. So individuals without proper designations were able to gain access to backstage areas. This is another thing where they're just letting this happen. Now, that is security stripping, and it's an old function of how you do this type of overthrow. And so I think the overthrow was on there, but the problem is the group that tends to operate overthrows like this is in the CIA, and you don't hear them mentioned in any of these reports. Other lapses in security protocol allegedly included a lack of personnel stationed around the security perimeter and inadequately enforced buffer zone around the podium. The podium's as close as you get, so you're dealing actually with the president there at the podium. Among the most troubling claims that the majority of personnel protecting the former president were not Secret Service agents. How do you get to a situation where President Trump, who's leading in the polls, is going to be the next president according to the trajectory, has already been president, and he's not being protected by Secret Service agents? Quote, whistleblower allegations suggest the majority of DHS officials were not in fact Secret Service agents, but instead drawn from the Department of Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, Hawley wrote. This is especially concerning given that HSI agents were unfamiliar with standard protocols they typically used at these types of events, according to the allegations. Okay. So we can see the security has been messed with to a point to open President Trump up to fire and assassination. Now, what was the story they had ready after the Crooks thing came out and it started to look a little bit weird? U.S. officials have gathered increasing amount of intel about Iran plotting to assassinate Trump. This is what they were trying to use as an overlay for this. Now, I go back again in my mind to Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald had worked for Guy Bannister in New Orleans in the summer before the assassination of President Kennedy. And it's quite fascinating because Guy Bannister was a right-wing former FBI head out of Chicago and was in New Orleans running this kind of government operation of infiltrating student groups on campuses. So he's completely right-wing, but Oswald works for him. And supposedly Oswald is this, communist connected to Russia and Cuba and all the rest of it, and had even lived in the Soviet Union. There were so few people in America who had lived in the Soviet Union at that period of time. To just imagine the network of the power of the network that got Oswald into Russia at that period of time is extraordinary, and had to come from the very top level of world government and intelligence affairs. Well, it's interesting when you look at his passport, because if you look at the passport of somebody else there, who's George Joannides, it is Joannides who will create the whole psychological operation of Oswald. Joannides was the top psychological officer and had been trained in Asia and other places to, carry out these psychological warfare experiments and projects and programs. He created the Oswald Cuba factor by having a group oppose Oswald and say, oh, he's with Fidel Castro and all the rest of it. Now, it's very interesting, and I have thought as we've gone along here that this is the greatest opening in the world to open up the JFK files. There's no better opportunity in the middle of all this confusion, because the overlap here is quite dramatic. Joannides, as we know, is not even included in the batch of JFK records that are to be released. He was such a major, deep player that the person who was in charge of the UFO file for the CIA, Bobby Inman, is the one who gives him his Lifetime Achievement Award. I've shown that the picture many times. But Joannides was given a Lifetime Achievement Medal because in 1976, after in 63, creating this incredible Oswald cover story about him being a communist and shooting President Kennedy and all the rest of it, and designing the whole psychological manipulation of the public with, hey, this commie did this. And he also gave J. Edgar Hoover this whole program about, say that he had a mother complex and, all these different things. He's disgruntled, and he was never happy with his life, and he was a loser and all these things. Hey, look, Oswald was sitting pretty, when he's sent over to Russia, they give him all this money to hang out in this apartment and live the life of Riley. And then, he's over in Atsugi in Japan at the top secret CIA basis developing the U-2, which is the top, and I mean the top aerospace project kept secret from the world at that time, and was scanning the skies and collecting all this. So Oswald was connected with a very high level of military and intelligence operations. So this idea of him, being dropped into this situation in a bookstore is quite interesting. Now, Joannides is fascinating because Jefferson Morley was the writer originally for the Washington Post. Then he got out of there when they wouldn't take his Kennedy story. This happened fairly recently, like in the past 20 years or so, that Joannides' name even came out. None of those researchers who were studying the JFK assassination and what took place with the CIA assassinating President Kennedy, they didn't have access to Joannides. This was the missing factor. As I said, even the law that went into effect in 1992 that you have to give up the JFK records in 2017, they didn't include the Joannides records. So Morley, along with some other people, including Professor Scott, tried to sue the CIA for the Joannides records. Over and over again, it came back, no, you can't have the Joannides records. Then they sued the CIA saying, under the statute, you have to give us the records. So Morley really took the case as far as it could go. And it's very interesting because Kavanaugh, who's a Supreme Court justice, was the one at the end who slammed down the gavel and said, "You're not getting them." So that guy's sitting on the Supreme Court bench right now. It's kind of interesting. But anyway, I think that we need to understand that the way that they move people into positions and create the legend around them, just like they're creating with Crooks here, is very interesting. The people that they used, the top people that they used in their psychological warfare piece, in this case, were Joannidis. Well, all we need about Joannidis in terms of the records that are available is how he was able to, what he was doing with the psychological operation of presenting Oswald this way to prove it on the record once and for all that the CIA created the Oswald situation as a cover for their activities in assassinating President Kennedy. That's very important. The fact that he's connected in any way at all with the UFO file is even more important. And I think in the person who's giving him the Lifetime Commendation Medal, Bobby Inman, it goes under what I call kind of hashtag put them under, which is put them under oath. Bobby Inman is actually one of the few people who's still alive that can tell us a great deal about this. And, I would say with a number of these people, they need to be put under oath. You can get to the bottom of a number of these things. If the assassination program that was operational 60 years ago can be reactivated at the drop of a hat, like you saw last Saturday, then that's a program that has been enhanced, if anything. There's been no reform. Show me reforms to the Central Intelligence Agency. They tried in the 1970s. It went offshore and became the Safari Club. Reagan got back in. All those officials, they all got returned to office. So, and then they did all the incredible drug running from Central and South America. They overthrew the El Salvadoran government, the Nicaraguan leadership, ran death squads and all the rest of it. So this is the nature of it. And then they got more arrogant because they thought, hey, we won the Cold War because, Berlin Wall came down and the Russians went down, and the CIA just became, more emboldened. And then you added, after 9/11, Homeland Security. So you have a national state apparatus now. And so therefore, situations, of course, all along the way, you're going to have security threats, just like around the RNC, they shot this individual who was carrying a weapon too close to the perimeter and all the rest. Those things always happen. But these types of organizations and the organization of these types of plots constitute deep state planning, and they rely on state actors in order to be able to do it. And they rely on covert forces to be able to pull it off. And then when it either unravels in one fashion or another, successful or not successful, there's a lot of debris on the top. And you bring people before these committees and all the rest of it. Maybe you get rid of some of them, yeah. But the structure itself stays intact. That's very important for us to note. I want to say this, that another string between Crooks and Oswald is that we have to remember this. The assassination of President Kennedy takes place November 22nd, but in the weeks leading up to it, a number of very strange things happen. For example, the assassination of the Diem brothers, who Kennedy had supported and were in office in Vietnam. The CIA decides, hey, we're going to assist the plotters, and they, in fact, assassinate the two leaders of Vietnam. This happens 3 weeks before the assassination of our president. So remember what they do, they have a kind of assassination season, and it needs to be looked at that way. You have another version of this between 1979 and 1981, where you have Anwar Sadat assassinated in Egypt. You have the presidential assassination attempt against Reagan by John Hinckley, whose father is a close friend of the Bushes, by the way, and Bush is waiting there, in a plane above everything, waiting to touch down to be welcomed as the new president after Hinckley was going to have eliminated Reagan. They just used Reagan to get into office. The interesting thing about the Reagan assassination attempt is it takes place only 3 months after he's in office. It's actually 2, because it's in March and he's inaugurated in January. So they didn't want Reagan around at all. And, whatever people say about Reagan, you have to think about a couple of things that really define him. One, he very much wanted an accountability around money and created a money commission to study gold as money, to study the manipulation of currencies and all the rest. And he wanted to get to the bottom of where the money in government was disappearing to. So the missing money aspect was a big piece of Reagan's presidency. And I think when they kind of informed him, you have to take Bush on the ticket, that was the end of any accountability, because Bush had come out of the leadership of the Central Intelligence Agency. And as a matter of fact, it's interesting with Bush. I don't know why this isn't brought up more. How did Bush get fired from the CIA? I wonder if you type that into Google what you'd get. Do you know what the answer is? Jimmy Carter fired George Bush because he asked him for everything related to the UFO file. This is on record. And Bush told him, "You don't have a need to know." And Carter sent back the word, "You're fired," and got Stansfield Turner, his friend, out of the military to take his place. And Stansfield Turner, was treated like a weird outsider. And so I think that this, this piece of the CIA kind of contending with the regular government is how you see the deep state assassination piece working. There's another weird thing where, Carter, at the end of his presidency, before he loses to Reagan, he's going to give this major speech, and it's, all about the new American doctrine militarily. And these two assassins show up, but one of them was named Oswaldo Harvey. I kid you not. Look up the case. I mean, there's no question about how they send messages to these people, and what level do they think they're playing on when they get into the presidency. Well, I think somebody like Trump had enough knowledge going in. He was aware of the Kennedy situation, and he had spent a lot of time with Nixon, and Nixon knew, and he knew deeply. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Deep state assassination, executive action, directive. We dodged a bullet. Literally, the former president dodged a bullet, and he may become President 47, President Trump. If we're lucky, we'll get that situation, and the Biden regime will fall. We still have, of course, as an interesting echo in the middle of all this, RFK Jr. running. And again, it brings up the specter of the Kennedy assassination, Robert Kennedy in 1968, heading toward the presidency. Again, assassinated not by Sirhan, who's the guy who was grabbed and put in prison, a la Oswald, but he's actually assassinated by Thane Eugene Caesar, who was an employee of Skunkworks and came out of that milieu of Skunkworks. We have to keep that in mind as we go also.
Since you just mentioned that,
yeah,
we should mention the 6-state election parallel with Biden dropping out.
Yeah, that's really true. Let me put a couple of things on with this. Okay, first of all, that season of assassination piece. Slovak prime minister who was shot in an assassination attempt is released from the hospital. That just came out. So they try to do this guy in, and he had given a speech that he basically wasn't going to go along with the World Economic Forum. And there's a number of interesting things about this guy, but they try to take him out, and they also didn't succeed, which I think is an odd piece about this pattern, that they're using assassinations as a warning, perhaps. The attempts as a warning. In the Kennedy assassination, as I mentioned, although he is assassinated November 22nd, 1963, in Miami, they're ready to assassinate him from a tall office building. They get word of it. They divert his route, and he's not assassinated. They have tapes of the people who are discussing this, including someone named Joseph Miltier, who the FBI will later investigate, interview, and then let go and release. The Chicago plot I find particularly interesting, and it's the Secret Service agent Abraham Bolden who gives us the account of this. And Bolden was sent to prison for a false bribery charge and was, interestingly enough, just pardoned recently. And it's interesting because President Kennedy had big plans for Bolden because he was the first African-American Secret Service agent.
Didn't Trump pardon him?
No, it actually came under Biden,
Oh, okay.
interestingly enough. And it's interesting. Also, when we consider it, when we look at the Chicago plot, Bolden gives us some very unusual information, which may be a powerful piece of history that's been missed. But what happened was they had Thomas Arthur Valley, and he was the Oswald lookalike here. And he also had the same background. He was an ex-Marine. He was disgruntled. They gave him this different background. But he was caught because he had blown a traffic light. And when they busted him, they were suspicious. And what they did with Valley is they checked his trunk, and it was loaded with weapons. Then when they checked out his address and where he was planning to be during the Kennedy motorcade, he was going to be in a high window overlooking the motorcade at his job. And when they went to his hotel, there were more weapons there and all the rest. But the person who had given them the information, according to Bolden, was an informant they had named Lee. Now, this is very interesting because it goes to this idea of Oswald as this double agent actually working for the government, feeding them leads and information and thinking, I'm penetrating the assassination and the people involved. And then they stage him like a stooge up there in the sixth floor of the Texas School Book Depository. And he's the one who's been penetrating the assassination. So he's been walking in the footsteps of these people, and then they do the assassination and leave him holding the bag. So this was Garrison's take on the whole thing, that he thought Oswald had been working for the government. And then the government, after he had, done this for them, just killed him real quick, as he said. Another thing for us to keep in mind, Trump with Connally and Nixon. I pointed this picture out before. We added the X from a particular episode at one point. This picture is very important because Nixon is standing there with John Connally, who was in the death car with President Kennedy during the assassination. And that is Trump next to him. And as I've mentioned before, with photo ops, it doesn't happen very often. You do photo ops as a politician for a reason. The signaling of this, for me, is Nixon, Connally, and Trump. And Nixon is somehow signaling presidential power. He's a former president. Connally is the one who survived the bullet, and it's Trump over there on the other side, kind of absorbing the impact of all this. I always think that those types of pictures say 1,000 words. One other thing I want to mention about Oswald and what we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about Crooks is people have been wondering how he got into the position that he was in, and how could it be done with the Secret Service there and everything else. If this deep state apparatus is moving you into position, that they have incredible abilities to do it. And they also can warn off other agencies from observing them. So this is what we see in this case. And you'll find the incredible travel enterprise of Lee Harvey Oswald, literally traveling the world, as it were, but supposedly completely broke. And then when the time comes for him to leave Russia, he actually loans the money from the State Department, over $1,500, to get back to the United States. So you're looking at something very unusual there. If you look at the Lenin assassination, you're going to find Mark David Chapman, who very much fits the mold of Crooks and Hinckley and these others. And what they did with Mark David Chapman is quite remarkable, because whatever he was doing for them as they were sending him to all different points of the globe, and that's throughout Asia and even into war-torn Beirut, where he spent over a year, which was the assassination capital, basically, of the world at the time. But Mark David Chapman, again, was supposed to be a low-level security guard, minimum wage guy, and interestingly enough, he had original Dalis in his art collection. After his death, they went through his apartment and all this stuff, and you had all this incredible artwork. So if this guy who travels the world, has incredible artwork, and by the way, before he shoots John Lennon, he's hanging out in New York City, and he's ordering high-priced hookers from escort services and living in the top, and I mean the top hotel in New York. These guys are moved into position, and just a little bit of research as to where that is coming from opens up the question immediately. There's somebody funding their activities as they move around the world. John Hinckley Jr., of course, was part of the same world church that Hinckley was part of. And his dad did all these organizations through it. His dad was an oil man from Colorado who funded so much of Bush's activities, so much so that they would have dinner together. So, you've got Hinckley there was involved in this. Well, the Bush thing with Reagan, they just thought, we'll take Reagan out. And this is how they do it. And it's interesting because I would say that there are occasions with the deep state where they do miss or where it becomes too controversial for them to go any further. And I think what they did in the case of Reagan and Bush is they wanted to install Bush. They couldn't get him in through a normal election because he was too unpopular. Reagan came in with a huge election mandate, and they thought, we have to make him take Bush as his vice president. He didn't want to. As a matter of fact, at a certain point, Bush had said that his program was voodoo economics. So they had their ways and means, and they made a deal in the back on this. Now, a couple of more things about our assassination season with the deep state. Hold on. I made reference to Winston Lawson there. There's only a few pictures of Lawson who operated with this emergency apparatus of COG. He was the Secret Service agent who was connected to COG. That's one of the only shots of him with President Kennedy. And again, he was the one who set up the Dallas detail for the Secret Service. So you have COG there ushering the president into ambush, along with the mayor, who was the brother of the CIA assistant director, Charles Cabal, that Kennedy had fired. That's all significant, and it wasn't the kind of thing that the original researchers had access to. So I think that we can now revise all of the historical aspects relating to the Kennedy assassination, just showing how the intel agencies assassinated President Kennedy. In light of the events last Saturday, this would be the time to try to crack those records open, and it would make a huge difference in our understanding of it, and also make it much more difficult for them to get the Secret Service to stand down at events in the future. I did mention these tragic events, and again, I can see the tragedy in them, in the way that I report on them. I don't gloss over the tragedy, but I'm trying to give us an angle, a way that we can look at these things and get a better, kind of deeper understanding of what was happening. In the case of Robert Kennedy being shot, as I said, the shots were very close. So they were within 2 inches, according to Thomas Noguchi, who was the coroner who examined the body. And the only person within 2 inches was the security guard named Thane Eugene Caesar, who fled to Indonesia, by the way. And it's interesting because when I had a conversation with RFK Jr. in relation to this, he told me that he had talked to Thane Eugene Caesar and had set up a meeting. He was going to meet him, and Caesar was going to admit all this. But Caesar died. The daughters of Caesar got back to RFK Jr. and said, this was within a couple of weeks of when they were going to meet. Caesar had died. Now, Caesar was fairly old at that point, but it's quite convenient timing if you think about it. But Caesar, remember this, when we look at these assassinations and where the assassins come from, they come out of this exotic technology line. There's some connection in these deep state, in the apparatus of this that connects them up. In the case of Thane Eugene Caesar, we have to remember that Bobby Kennedy's assassination takes place under unusual circumstances, where there's a security guard assigned to him that has only been working for the hotel for 3 days. So, they knew Kennedy was coming in. They had Thane Eugene Caesar walking behind him. And the witnesses there, who were so freaked out by Sirhan and, the mind control antics of shooting and all the rest of it, everyone agrees that he was 6 to 8 feet in front of Robert Kennedy. But people saw Thane Eugene Caesar draw his weapon. Did the FBI or the cops want his weapon? No, they never asked for it. So therefore, you're left with that situation. But when you go into Thane Eugene Caesar and his history, like as I mentioned, and he's in the documentary UFO File Assassins that I did, you're going to find his whole history. And his history at the time was working at Skunkworks. And Skunkworks at the time was the ultimate UFO redevelopment center in aerospace. That's what we had. And of course, it was Ben Rich from Skunkworks who gave us the quote, "We know now, we have the technology now to send ET home." So however else you want to think of skunk works, whether you think it's UFO related or not, it certainly represents that advanced exotic technology, airspace connection, and somehow Thane Eugene Caesar's right in the middle of it. We pointed out in the case of Lee Harvey Oswald, he comes out of Guy Bannister. It's Guy, working with Guy Bannister the summer before the assassination. So you've got them working, in the case of Guy Bannister, he's the guy who started the X-Files UFO collection program. He's the one who went around studying it. So you have to put those things on that level. And then once we understand that Trump is involved through his uncle with the UFO file, started the Space Force, you're opening up a much larger vista as to what that technology represents in the flow of our regular politics and geopolitics in America and around the world. So it has to become part of the conversation if you want to get to the bottom of it. Otherwise, we'll just be looking at factional infighting aspects or, things where people will say, oh, you know what? The public went too far excoriating these people. They're human. They make mistakes too. And they'll put out this whole overlay about it. And you'll get that. And it'll be just some forgotten incident where they say, oh, they forgot to give Trump the right coverage, but, they're human. They made mistakes. Certainly, you can make the case that they're human, but it's no mistake stripping the security on that level. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Deep state assassination, executive action, directive. I have a lot more to get to here, but we're going to go to your questions now. I'll try to plug in a few things as we go along. Miss Olivia, you're
all
up.
right. There's tons to get through. So let's start here. Safe and Effective says, none of this makes sense on any level. Inside job, deep state, staged, incompetence. Not one of these adds up. And Scarlet Fire says, quote, Biden was selected to make sabotage seem like incompetence.
Yeah, isn't that true? Well, Biden, it was interesting because the Democrats were losing and losing badly at the beginning of 2020. And Biden had lost. He lost in New Hampshire. He was done for. And Obama didn't get behind him and say, I endorse him or anything like that. He waited. He waited a long time. And it was Bernie Sanders who was running away with all of those primaries. So somewhere along the way, they decided, you know what? We can kind of do this groundswell and connect him with Obama. Let's do this. And the fact that he is not so mentally with it might come and actually be to our advantage. And it's interesting as you go down, Biden didn't do any real, it's kind of fascinating. He didn't do any real campaigning. And they had COVID as the excuse or whatever, and they had the phony mail-in ballots and that whole thing. So they knew how they were going to do this. And at a certain point, when you got into October of that year, Trump got COVID. And there were weird things that were going on there. And I believe that Trump had it in mind. They were raising COG almost every week. And they had the COG commander, who's usually a completely inconspicuous figure, giving interviews at MSNBC. And, I mean, this guy they were going to plug in. And they did replace him. And now we're into two different commanders after that guy. But it's very interesting because when you look at that, I think that their plan was, we're not sure we can pull off the election piece with Biden here. It's going to be quite an effort to make this stick. That's one. Two, COG is just as viable an option. Let's test this. Let's test the field in this. And once Trump got COVID, it seemed to me that they were looking to do it. And Nancy Pelosi gave an interesting interview, I believe it was in mid-October, where she said, I just had a large briefing from COG. Now, they never talk about COG. As I said, it was left off the table over and over again. And COG, as I pointed out, we just did an episode that included it last week or 2 weeks ago. But the continuity of government program had been in place now, remember, since right after World War II, expanded greatly during the Eisenhower years. The idea of it being something that could blunt the decapitation of the leadership with a nuclear strike by having a secret government underground that could still run the activities of the United States in the event of that emergency. Those protocols were rapidly changed in the 1980s through private citizens, government officials, and aerospace officials. Some of those people involved were Dick Rumsfeld. And it's interesting because Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. Donald Rumsfeld at that time was the CEO of a pharmaceutical company. He wasn't even in government. He had previously been the defense secretary under Ford, but he wasn't anybody at that point. So for him to be involved in laying out COG, this is part of what we got from Professor Scott that was so unusual. And the other person they got was a Wyoming congressman named Dick Cheney, and he was part of it. So those two people would activate COG during the 9/11 emergency. And that's when they have Cheney going into the mountain and coming out like Moses with the 10 Commandments with the Patriot Act, this whole kind of worked out thing. So you have to look at those things and say COG has already been activated. And the fact that they re-up the 9/11 emergency every year through the National Defense Authorization Act lets us know that that system is working side by side with us, which isn't the kind of thing that I want to, it's not to make people worry about COG, it's to become aware of it as a factor in the midst of all this. So when you see a president almost assassinated, the leading presidential candidate, former President Trump, then you have to say, with the explanations that have come out, it doesn't make sense. And then you understand further that the Secret Service would never leave those types of gaps. Then you understand further, it looks like there are multiple shooters involved. So then you can see that you're in the midst of something else. So it is this deep state factor walking into the public space. And we have to be aware of that factor while at the same time holding back, just cynicism, pure cynicism about the government, or, bringing in imaginative junk conspiracy. So it's not easy. And I think the FBI, assistant FBI director thing that floated around is a really good example, because I didn't promote it. Because I knew this is not, to just say, hey, this person looks like the picture of the woman behind Trump. Very big accounts ran with that picture. And this is another thing. I think it is that type of thing where if they put in the junk conspiracy and have people pick up on it, it'll make the independent media look foolish. That's the object. So you have to be very careful. And how can you be careful like that, and also there's a lot of clickbaity stuff. So I think that whole thing of what the independent media is about should be much more serious. And I've been seeing high level people, coming in and recreating themselves in their career as independent media people. And they seem to be the most irresponsible of all. So I think it has to be looked at and spotlighted. Yes.
Okay. It is chaos in the chat. All right.
I want to say we're only going to do about maybe another 10 minutes here. So get them in.
Okay.
We'll take them now.
So I'm going to combine all these together. Caritas Tarot. Is there a case to be made that iconic pic came out of a staged political theater? DJ's thoughts. Bobby Bobinson says, mainstream media were exceptionally covering it live. The photographer who caught the iconic shot was the same guy who caught the photo of W hearing about the 9/11 attacks. Audra Warless, what does DJ think about it being said that this is the first Trump rally CNN has been at all year? And to answer all of that, Space Ghost says, I've not seen anyone mention the hole in his jacket. He took it in his chest also. Video doesn't lie.
Well, yeah, I don't know. You'd have to photographically analyze the hole in the jacket thing. It could, I'm not convinced that that's a bullet hole. It could very well be. And I would say it looks like it, get some good photo analysis on it for sure. No, it's not staged. There's nothing staged about the incident. It's not a staged incident, So when things are that dangerous, and when you're bringing, they wanted to eliminate Trump with that shooting. That's a fact. There's nothing staged about it. People got killed. So the fact that this photo was caught that was iconic and all the rest of it, that will happen in the middle of events like that. That doesn't bother me. The photo that bothers me is that there may have been foreknowledge. This is what I think is important. There may have been foreknowledge that President Trump was going to be assassinated, was supposed to have been assassinated. And that's why certain photographers from very big name media companies came with a certain type of lens loaded. And they had the settings on a certain type of thing that would catch, for example, that unusual trajectory of the bullet and would actually catch the bullet in flight. Those aren't typical settings if you're just doing portrait photography at a campaign event. So that is where the heart of it. You see how you have their dark journalism versus junk conspiracy. The junk conspiracy is the staged, right? And that's meant to kind of give you some pause or doubt about things. There's nothing staged about the incident. Trump was shot, and people in the audience were killed. So, I mean, and the assailant, the person who they got to take the blame for all this, Crooks, he was killed instantly, and so we never have any testimony from him about what happened. But I think it's very likely that he was not the person who was shooting. That he wasn't the person who was shooting at Trump. That we assume those bullets came from him. I'm sure he shot at Trump, but I've seen some audio analysis that shows there was somebody about 70 yards behind him who was shooting. And I think that analysis, which will come out further and we'll hear more about, I think that analysis is going to show at least 2 shooters, probably 3. And I think that they were shut down after missing because of Trump's movement. And he has a tendency to move his head in such a rapid fashion when he's describing something that this was just some kind of strange luck, in my opinion, that he was not assassinated. But I think obviously the Secret Service putting him in a situation where he could be assassinated is the glaring piece here, along with the fact that obviously there were other shooters involved.
Yeah, I also just want to make a statement about certainty and uncertainty, and that we should at this point all be mature enough emotionally to be able to sit with uncertainty and to allow new data to come in and reassess our position and our opinions.
Absolutely. Yeah, it takes time to unravel the thing. I think the answers that you want is some of the things that Josh Hawley was talking about, which is why they switched out a bunch of Secret Service agents for these Department of Homeland Security people. That represents whoever organized that. You have some link back in the structure to who was organizing this. In my opinion, the factor that was doing that is invisible. So you're not going to be able to point to a person and say, aha, we have the conspirator. I think it's going to be very hard. Unfortunately, but we're going to be aware that this was a conspiracy to assassinate President Trump. There's no question in my mind about that. I want to read you something from Professor Scott's book, Dallas 63, about COG, because again, I want to keep the real COG out there as a point. We've presented COG on this program, the Continuity of Government program. I think it does play such a major role, and it's still so little understood. And I think the bastardization that comes out sometimes, hey, COG, keeps a list of dissidents. That's important, but it's that's a small piece of what COG is set up to do. I think it is important, but then there's another thing that just says, oh, COG is already activated and you're living under COG right now. So you see these things get thrown out and they're thin versions of what the actual program looks like. And also you can confirm on record about what the program is and what it does. So it's not even something you have to guess at or make up things about. It is dramatically, it's a dramatically extra constitutional setup. And it's a relic from a Cold War era where you really needed it. And then on top of that, it's been morphed. Some of the changes that came about in continuity of government happened under 2 administrations, the Reagan administration and W. Bush. W. Bush in 2007 made a number of extra changes to it. And I think that something like, the COVID operation was thought about in terms of this. As a matter of fact, there was a whole thing on the shelf about anthrax and what would happen if there was a gigantic anthrax outbreak. And it was very interesting because they had terms. If you look at the Bush administration documents, it's on the record where they had the terms social distancing and things like that they would eventually implement under the COVID op. So it's pretty interesting when you think of it like that. When you get to the actual 9/11 setup with the Patriot Act and all the rest of it, it's such a consolidation of democratic principles that you're starting with one type of country, and by the time you get to the other side of the 9/11 event, COG gets activated, and you get things like TSA, you get warrantless wiretapping, and all these other types of things. So it's almost like you become a different country the minute that COG is activated. So where we could look at the activation of continuity of government now, an event like what took place, if President Trump had been assassinated and a certain type of unrest had taken place in the country, then you could have seen literally the activation of COG. It was that close. So we're lucky. We're tremendously lucky that the assassin's bullet missed. And of course, in the life of the country and the president's family, all the rest, everyone, breathes an incredible sigh of relief. And yet, as I've pointed out to these people who've been saying, he's going in, he's going to be the president now. It's all set. It's done. It's not a cakewalk. It doesn't work that way. And 3 months to the election is a lifetime. And I would agree. It certainly looks like President Trump will be in there, and certainly they ran a great convention. He's got the right message. Stepford Biden has destroyed the country by allowing the border to collapse and allow tens of millions of people in. And inflation and other things, the disaster in Ukraine. I mean, the administration is literally one of the worst things I think that has ever been imposed on the American people. But nonetheless, with them controlling the White House and all these various agencies like NSA, NRO, CIA, there's a lot of things they can do between now and then. So I think, if anything, having the idea of a very strong campaign finish for President Trump should be on everybody's radar. And this whole thing about how it's over, it's a done deal is some of the worst type of prognosticating I've seen out there. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, here's another bunch. Robert Ayala, DJ, do you think that three-letter agency was really behind the failed attempt to assassinate Trump? They do not have a record of failure. Could this be a group that acted alone in a precipitated way? Alex Leggett says, I wonder if the CIA has embraced its bad image and just outsources their dirty work, and they're fine taking the heat because it takes the eyeballs off the true players. Greedy Cat says, which people do you think are making deep state decisions? And Mark Tarana says, what is Mayorkas's role in this attempted assassination?
Well, see, that's the thing. I don't think that you can take somebody like who's a department head, like Mayorkas, and say that he's connected to the assassination. But you can see that an apparatus could use somebody like that to put certain people in position or to have security stand down. That apparatus is hard. It's very hard to track. You can find its footprints, but it's very difficult. And it's like I said with the FBI woman that they were running around, you have to be extremely careful about ascribing blame because it's convenient. You have to know. And that is, again, a legal process. If they knew somebody like Mayorkas, they'd have to prosecute him and still prove it. So, but no, I think that Mayorkas is corrupt. And I think that he's acted illegally as Homeland Security. I think Homeland Security, in my opinion, is extra constitutional. It does not fall inside of a constitutional window. So I think the whole organization is illegal. Anyone could argue that case. I think it's a fact. And it came into, it came out of this whole Patriot Act overreaction to 9/11. And again, the questions around 9/11 went into the whole area. There's a whole show and many shows that we've done on 9/11 with the great Jim Marrs, the late Jim Marrs, Dr. Farrell, and others. We know from great research that people have done that case is nothing like how it's been described. And we also know that there's a great cover-up involved. Professor Scott said the JFK assassination has so much in common with 9/11, the event, including the fact of having designated culprits. So the designated culprit, I think, is very interesting because in Oswald's case, they took the designated culprit and they made sure he was off of things like the Secret Service radar by taking him out of the FBI files 6 weeks before, being like, he's no longer a threat. Don't pay attention to him. He's just a defector. Whereas ordinarily, he'd be very high on their radar. They would be watching him. In the case of the 9/11 hijackers, they also were taken off a number of watch lists and things just before they do what they have to do. And in Professor Scott's work, what I find so interesting is how you can track just before things happen. There are certain changes that take place. Like, for example, the whole thing about if we have a missing plane, if we have a plane that's not signaling back, do you have to involve the Secretary of Defense? And these rules had just been changed before 9/11 so that Rumsfeld could easily say, oh, they didn't tell me about this. And so it's that movement of things to set up the perfect outcome, and that these people will be blameless when it hits. This is also very important. And you have to keep that in mind. And it reminds me, one of the things I wanted to get to tonight and didn't so much was how the CIA overthrew Arbenz in Central America. And it's so interesting because, again, they use the term PB as part of their code. Nobody still knows what PB was. And that's why I referred to the Trump assassination attempt as PB overthrow. I do want to share a couple of quick things with you, but I'll end up doing something more on the Arbenz situation. But I think it is textbook for how the deep state forces work, and in this case, the Central Intelligence Agency, which, by the way, is the top expert in assassinations that we have in America. So therefore, they should at least be consulted. I'm sure it's very interesting that they're leaving them completely out of this process. How about the question, were there CIA agents or assets just at the event that day? How about answering that? Certainly with them dangling the idea of an Iranian group that wanted to assassinate Trump, it's plausible. You don't hear anything about that. So this is interesting. Operation PB Success. This is the operation that Dulles set up for the overthrow of Arbenz. And a lot of this gets interesting because they say, oh, they were afraid he was going to turn communist or whatever. But I think he was just inflexible and not really, he wasn't as pliable to their missions as they wanted him to be. In August 2013, the U.S. government formally acknowledged the U.S. role in the coup in Iran against Mossadegh. So we were just on a kind of a coup high at that point. We got so good at it, and eventually they turned that apparatus inward. But a couple of things about PB Success, which is they termed the code name for their headquarters was Lincoln. I thought that was interesting because it represented the idea and the understanding of once you took the official out, all the policies could change. And so they're using President Lincoln as the nickname for the thing. PB Prime is what the CIA in their secret documents called the United States. And I find that interesting, the psychological warfare aspect around this Operation PB Success. I'm just going to read a couple of things about that operation, see how they kind of add up with this. We'll take a couple more questions and then we'll let you go for the night. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Deep State Assassination, Executive Action Directive, special report on the attempted assassination of President Trump and all of its glaring and absolutely seismic implications. And of course, the fact that we breathe an incredible sigh of relief on one hand that they weren't able to do it, and also understand the deep state assassination season that we're in. And that's not so easy to take a deep breath about. Okay. propaganda campaign that the CIA used. It had begun well before the investigation. The U.S. Information Agency was writing hundreds of articles on Guatemala based on CIA reports and distributing tens of thousands of leaflets throughout Latin America. The CIA persuaded friendly governments to screen video footage of Guatemala that supported the U.S. version of events. As part of the psychological warfare, the U.S. Psychological Strategy Board authorized a nerve war against individuals. Now, they wanted to install fear and paranoia in potential loyalists and other potential opponents of the coup. This campaign included death threats against political leaders deemed loyal or deemed to be communist, and the sending of small wooden coffins, non-functioning bombs, and hangman nooses to such people. The U.S. bombing was also intended to have psychological consequences, with E. Howard Hunt, who, of course, very involved in the Kennedy assassination, their top CIA guy, of the CIA saying, what we wanted to do was to have such a terror campaign to terrify our Benz, particularly to terrify his troops, much as the German Stuka bombers terrified the populations of Holland, Belgium, and Poland. So part of this operation is, assassinating Trump would have terrified these groups. Remember, people like Mayorkas and Merrick Garland tried to put MAGA people who just, professed in believing in making America great again. They wanted to put them on watch lists, right? And they did. And they put people on watch lists who were complaining at these school meetings that they didn't want their, kid getting indoctrinated into thinking he was a different gender or she was a different gender. So those moms got put in these lists and all the rest of it. Well, that's Merrick Garland. That's Mayorkas. These are the people who are creating those lists. That is the FBI creating the list where they're putting America in the crosshairs for this. So there's no question that they are accountable for that. That doesn't require a conspiracy. It's on the record. We know it. But you see how much it has in common with PB success and things that they've done in the past where they achieve these incredible results, and how tempted they are to use those same results, same methods to achieve the same results, in an updated situation. Now, I do feel that when you see those waves of assassination, and you can see it right back during the Kennedy era, there are a series of attempts around the world to eliminate leaders. Of course, they assassinated the Diem brothers in Vietnam, as I mentioned. But before that, the UN Secretary, Dag Hammarskjöld, they shoot him down in his plane, which is going over Africa. And he really was resisting what the CIA wanted in this case. And there had been this attempt to overthrow de Gaulle in France. They had these generals who were going to take over. And de Gaulle asked Kennedy after the fact, he said, I know the CIA was involved. And Kennedy said to them, I have to tell you, we do not have complete control over this thing. We're still trying to find out which aspect of the CIA was involved in trying to get you out. So Kennedy is scrambling in his own administration to try to find where this apparatus is. So we've been living with this for a long time. We've had grandparents who went through that era. This is what was going on in the background. They lived through the Kennedy assassination. We've had parents who lived through, the Robert Kennedy assassination, the Reagan attempt, and things of this. So it's been with us for a long time. A number of people in the ideas room probably even remember the Kennedy assassination. So it's a factor. It's for a long time they thought, well, we can keep it over here and just call everyone else conspiracy theorists. So over the last 10 years, they've lost some of that. And what they tend to do, I said, is sort of hug into the middle and align with it and say, like, well, it's not only that, but they throw in the junk conspiracy that goes with it. And so they obfuscate what's going on. So I think the way that we can look at it and really get a handle on it is by understanding that the reason that they would try to remove somebody like Trump is because he's opposed to everything that they want to do. so that the kind of global empire building factor is not something that he and what he represents is aligned with. He's still aligned and represented by the Fortress America group, which is a different part of the deep state. And so Trump comes out of that angle. But remember this, that I've put so much emphasis around aerospace, and there's an exotic technology part in the middle of all this that we have to understand that Trump is related to, that he's a part of. That's where Space Force comes in and all the rest of it. And that is kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back. They don't want him involved in any of that decision-making process. Look, they went to such great lengths to make sure that Kennedy and Khrushchev could not be sitting there alone negotiating things. The same thing went down in relation to Reagan and Gorbachev. And Gorbachev got these great stories and the results that Reagan got were genuine reductions in that nuclear threat, but other things must have happened when they went off alone, just with them and the translator. The other thing is, of course, Trump and Putin. They didn't want that to happen. So that resistance shows you where the real power clash is in the world, because they wouldn't be upset otherwise. They'd be like, hey, the American leader is meeting with the Russian leader. That's a good thing. Maybe we'll get peace out of that. No. You can't be. If there's that alignment between Russia and the United States, watch out. That's the biggest threat to whatever this other thing is. You have to find out what the other thing is. Yes.
Okay, Kontiki Man, the bigger picture being the visit from Viktor Orban, whose ally Robert Fico also barely survived an assassination attempt.
Right.
Fico was working with Viktor Orban to broker a deal with Putin.
Yes. That's a good point. And I think what bothers that deep state aspects about the Hungarian leader is that he's been so successful. And he instantly, Orban has that link with Trump, like a lot of leaders do. They see him as somebody genuine and that they can work with. A lot of the other leaders, I think, do respect him. And I think in China and Russia and places like that, they would work in a much different fashion. When Russia is working with Biden, they know that the kind of Victoria Nuland neocon aspect is just thinking of ways to corner Russia and to make them submissive. And so they've responded in this fashion. And it's so important, when I've read the details on how close we are to a nuclear exchange with Russia, I just want to, in a way, I'd like to do broadcasts almost every day telling people about that. We cannot afford to have a nuclear exchange with Russia. That's just, and so the idea of these people pushing this situation and saying, we're going to take NATO as far as it'll go with Ukraine right to the doorstep of Russia, because, that's what triggered off Russia to invade parts of Ukraine. And of course, I don't think Russia should be in there either, but we're giving them justification by supporting this action. So the Ukraine situation, which we've spent billions of dollars on and greased the palms of criminals and all the rest of it, and this whole sham leader and all the rest, that is a situation which President Trump, I believe, will end almost immediately when he gets into office. It's something that RFK Jr. has brought up. And, there was that call that leaked from RFK Jr. Receiving a call from President Trump, and Trump talking about the hazards of vaccines and how it would be good to have Bobby working on something. That's a new call. That just happened right after the assassination. It was the next day. And it got leaked out actually by Bobby's son. And they were pretty mad about it. Bobby was pretty mad about it. But actually, what's interesting is it showed Trump is very aware around this aspect, although he's been pegged, with all of this pharmaceutical side. You have to look at a lot of the things that were going on in 2020, I think, to understand this. And also, I don't think Trump is a very big biotech guy, and the idea that he's reaching out to Kennedy there to try to say, hey, you can be involved with this and all the rest. I think that Kennedy should look at this whole situation and say, there's no way I'm getting the presidency under these circumstances, and say, in order to make the best difference, I should throw my support to Trump and then try to work with him in his administration. That's what I would advise Bobby Jr. to do at this point. And I think he's raised the very good issues in the campaign. And I think he's shown that he can be a very good candidate, which means he could be an excellent shape for 2028, as a potential. So that's what I would do, because this is clearly getting rid of the Biden regime is clearly the goal. Yes.
Sacred Force wants to know, DJ, has a deal been made for RFK Jr. to be in the administration?
I think Trump attempted to make that deal. I think the fact that it got out was a little problematic. Trump's been pretty generous with RFK Jr. This is interesting. And RFK has maintained, kind of a more aggressive stance towards him than he did toward Biden, which I always found confusing. I'll tell you another weird thing in the crystal ball of all this. With them shuffling the deck with Biden and potentially trying to replace the candidate during the August convention because he's just not with it, and even, his friends at NBC News are trying to get him out. That's pretty hardcore. But it is interesting because if Bobby had stayed in the primary, he would have done pretty well in those primaries, but they wouldn't have, while Biden was in there, given it to him. But how would he have looked? Maybe that Democratic structure is too corrupt, but if he had got some momentum during those primaries and then they were taking out Biden, he would be in a very interesting situation with the Democratic Party. Instead, they did this independent thing, which you need time to set up. And then they got the weird Shanahan billionaire VP and all the weird stuff. But the core of it, I think that the core of Bobby's message about transparency and about, corporate accountability and the pharmaceutical crimes and all the rest of it was absolutely important. And so I think that makes him a very good candidate for next time. And I think he could set himself up very well helping Trump to organize his cabinet. I think he would look good not only doing a vaccine commission, but he could look good as attorney general. There's a series of things that Bobby could do, but he has to, there's kind of an apparatus around Bobby, which is not seeing what's going on the ground, which is there's no way that Bobby can win the presidency at this point. It's either, it's basically Trump is the only one that can smash that system and win. And as I said, I still don't even think that's going to be a cakewalk. Yes.
Do you want to mention this? The All Music official YouTube channel says RFK Jr. again was asked to be VP. RFK Jr. refused. This I know.
Oh, I know that he was asked to be VP earlier, and that Trump did put that out to him. And I think even he's confirmed now that he said no, which is too bad because it would have been an incredible opportunity. But nonetheless, that ship has sailed, and they have Vance in there now. You just have to kind of, roll the dice and see what happens. But there's no question that Trump is doing gracious overtures to RFK Jr., and it's a perfect matchup. It'd be great having Bobby out there promoting Trump's last, term in office, and then saying, I'm an heir to some of the ideas he brought forward, or just, showing himself. I think that the campaign still has this kind of fantasy about a contingent election and all this stuff. They would never, if no one got to 270 in this election, and now I'm more convinced that they will, but if in that weird fantasy scenario, if no one got to 270, there's no one in Congress that would ever vote for, the way that it works is every congressperson votes, and whoever gets the most votes win. And, nobody in Congress would vote for Bobby. I would think that Trump or Biden, they would get the majority of the congressional votes. Who is feeding that into Bobby Kennedy's ear that would work? That's crazy. They have no way to get to 270. I don't even think they can get electoral votes this time because it was too hastily arranged. Nothing to be ashamed of. They brought the good ideas. They injected the good ideas. Bobby proved himself very capable. And I think he would be a very good-looking independent candidate for 2028. There's no question. Actually, if he had stuck in with the Democratic process and they throw out Biden by August, he might have been in that roller derby. But no, I think 2028 would be ideal for him. Or just be in the president's cabinet. I think there's a lot he could do there. Trump was saying, look, you and I both know there's something on the vaccine side you can do that would be big for you. Let's talk about this. He was looking for his endorsement. And those people around the Bobby campaign they're not with what's going on, especially after the events of last Saturday. There's not going to be any third party surprise this time around. Yes.
Okay. Should we talk about CrowdStrike?
No, actually, what I want to do, I'm going to leave all the CrowdStrike stuff for the next go around because we don't have enough going in there. But it is, I think, unusual and is the setup for some kind of a cyber attack. I want to make a quick point about the Secret Service, and this goes. I want to show this first. This goes to a media campaign that was going on throughout Trump's presidency. There were a lot of weird things that alluded to assassination from the media. It was almost like a threat. And very often during the period where he was running in 2020, they would show him from the back of the head in the articles. You'd have an article about Trump. They would show the back of his head. And I pointed it out at the time, and everyone found it very strange. And we could point to The Atlantic was doing it. New York Times was doing it. It was weird. It was genuinely creepy activity. Now, what I found further on that track was in 2017, they did an article in Vanity Fair. Now, the Kevin Costner movie, the Oliver Stone film about JFK, about Jim Garrison's case, opening up the JFK assassination and the files and everything else. This was the movie poster that they had, and Kevin Costner, of course, played Garrison in the film. But the film is all about the JFK assassination. Vanity Fair ran this after Trump got in office, and I thought, that's a weird thing to do, because you're putting him in the movie poster of the JFK assassination. And they're using the three initials there, DJT. And this was a big article where they pushed this idea of a Trump movie. But of course, the underlying theme is the assassination of President Kennedy, as we saw. And they brought that in as the JFK Revisited. Oliver Stone did a documentary on it. This is that kind of telegraphing, I think, was very active around Trump. And I think that he had his own security apparatus at a very heightened level. As we know, he made his own apparatus share the responsibility with the Secret Service when he was president. So it wasn't just the Secret Service. And he took a lot of precautions there. Somehow his own organization got caught flat-footed with the idea that the Secret Service piece would open up and leave him vulnerable. But they certainly did. And I think their goals were the exact same goals when they tried to assassinate Reagan. In that case, they were trying to get Bush, who was hovering around the United States in a plane waiting to come down and take over. And in this case, he hadn't selected a VP yet. So it would have been just this wide open thing, and it would have increased the chances for the Biden regime or someone from their ilk to take the presidency. So therefore, and let's remember that there was an old friendship forged back there, that Trump knew Reagan quite well. And he says that he intends to mirror his Star Wars program. And, that's something for another episode, but watch out, because Star Wars SDI carries with it a big punch. And let's not forget, John Hinckley Jr. is your Thomas Matthew Crooks of that incident. And again, people saying the shooting itself was highly, it was much more organized than this kind of guy firing from a window somewhere because he was in love with Jodie Foster. They always have a good story. And, he was obsessed with The Catcher in the Rye and wanted Jodie Foster to love him, so he's going to kill the president. those are the types of stories that the psychological operation officials come up with, as we know. And with that, Miss Olivia, the last question of the night.
Give me a minute.
Okay.
I got to boot somebody.
Excellent. It's okay.
We have had so many CIA trolls tonight.
Oh, really?
It has been crazy. I gave them room for expressing themselves, but they were really starting a lot of, they were being very disruptive. So anyway, I think it's, for the most part, it's cleaned up now. I do want to make sure that we cover this. So we need to go back to Iran. What would have happened if Trump had not survived? So Wally Tango Foxtrot says Iran failed plot or failed narrative because Trump survived. What was the plan there?
No, I think the Iran thing, there are multiple, scenarios that they could have come up with for that. It's on the record that they claim that they have, I've read this now in multiple publications, so the traditional media, CNN, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, they're saying U.S. officials have gathered increasing amount of intel about Iran plotting to assassinate Trump. That was their response to the Crooks thing. When the Crooks thing wasn't playing so well, they were like, maybe we can get Iran on this. And Iran immediately denied that they had any plans like that, of course. But I think the idea there is simple, which is the accountability, the diversion to another country follows the Oswald pattern, which was a diversion to Cuba. And also it gives us the ability, to look at Iran in a hostile fashion. And so for the people that are building up a war scenario or a distraction scenario, it works quite well, in fact. The other thing I wanted to read this. I guess we can't get everything in here tonight. One last thing on the FBI. That is a picture of FBI agents cleaning up the roof that Crooks was laying on with all the evidence and everything else. They're just hosing it down. I think that's a very emblematic picture for this case, because they're going to try to get rid of kind of the most important evidence and just say, oops, we didn't know, we cleaned it off. Including the fact that I don't think Crooks could have organized any of that. He couldn't have put himself into position. He couldn't have been running drones and all that stuff on his own. He was helped. He had tremendous help. And I think the more we look at him, we're going to see they didn't leave the shooting of President Trump to Crooks. They left it to whoever was shooting behind him. And it's just a miracle that they missed. And it was close. I mean, when people say, oh, the deep state doesn't miss, like, that was so close, that it's within the realm of possibility that anybody would miss.
Well, he didn't miss.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Trump,
good point.
Trump moved his head
he was
while the bullet was in flight. So on that note, I want to actually make sure I ask this. Caritas Tarot says, comment, I feel that humanity is evolving and we skip the killing and trauma into a better timeline. DJ's thoughts? And Richard Wilson says, several people I know felt a timeline shift. And Cyberview says, are we allowed to believe that God intervened here above the deep state?
Of course. We're talking about details here, and we're talking about different things that played out and also the forces that were involved with it. But when you take it up to a higher level, absolutely. And, you can see that we dodged a dramatic bullet. I don't even know, the odds on something like that, but they must be astronomical, So how about like a lightning bolt plus winning the lottery type odds that we missed it? But I would say this, which is the only thing that I think should come out of it, besides a feeling of gratitude that it didn't happen, is a very strong inclination to investigate it down to the last detail, one, and two, not this overconfidence on the political side that I've been hearing from the conservative pundits, like I've mentioned, and this really kind of overwhelming Trump, it's a done deal, Trump's in, and no, it doesn't work that way. You need to fight for every vote, and it's not a cakewalk at all. Last quote here, I'm going to leave it to Professor Scott, and he's talking about how the Secret Service installed the COG Doomsday Network through the Secret Service agent Winston Lawson during the ambush in Dealey Plaza. I think it's very telling, and let's see if we can get that. And then we will take your last question. We're out.
Okay.
Early on November 22nd at Love Field, Winston Lawson, the Secret Service agent for President Kennedy, installed in what would become the lead car the base radio whose frequencies were used by all Secret Service agents on the motorcade. This radio channel, operated by the White House Communications Agency, WHCA, was used for some key decisions in Dealey Plaza before and after the assassination, yet its records, unlike those of the Dallas Police Department, channels 1 and 2, were never made available to the Warren Commission or any other division, any other commission investigating this. So no subsequent investigations. The tape was not withheld because it was irrelevant. On the contrary, it contained very significant information. The White House Communications Agency actually reports to this day on its website that the agency was a key player in documenting the assassination of President Kennedy. However, it's not clear for whom this documentation was conducted or why it was not made available to the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee, or the Assassination Record Review Board. For one thing, the WHCA tapes, if some have alleged, may contain the key to the unresolved mystery of who, after the shooting, redirected the motorcade to Parkland Hospital. So showing again that this Doomsday Network, you can't track what they do. They keep the recordings, they have it, but it's just never supplied because they're under COG, the umbrella of the secrecy of COG. And then finally, COG planning was originally authorized by Truman and Eisenhower's planning for a response to a crippling atomic attack that had decapitated government. In consequence, its planning group contemplated extreme measures, including what Miami Herald reporter Alfonso Chardy in 1987 called the suspension of the Constitution. Yet in Iran-Contra, its asset of a secret communications network developed for the catastrophe of decapitation was used instead to evade an official embargo on arms sales to Iran that had dated back to 1979. I wish to propose here that the network may have been similarly misused in November 1963 during the Kennedy assassination to piggyback another operation on it. So this idea of the piggyback is very important, and we need to keep this in mind as we go. So, for example, a piggyback operation, they're doing a drill for terrorism or whatever. And as part of that drill, they set up America's defenses during 9/11 as was happening to, stand down what would happen if you, activated this or stood down this or whatever. And while it's happening, the actual event takes place. So whoever has access to that communications network would be able to know this. That's why the COG planning aspect can have such sway over events that we see on the ground. So the idea that one operation is going on and you throw in this other thing to piggyback on top of it has to become part of the dialogue when we look, for example, at this. So somebody had raised in one of those questions earlier a significant question, which is, do you think that was the deep state that did this, or was it some other kind of apparatus there in the government that was acting on its own in a rogue fashion, right? And I would say that it's very possible that there's a group that operates in a kind of invisible fashion. And so when you're having these setups for different things, they can say, because of the nature of the secrecy about the agency that we're talking about here, they can say, oh, we need you not to have Secret Service agents there because we're doing this whole surveillance thing over here. And when the event happens and takes place and these people, it's demanded in Congress, why didn't you move to this building to take over and make sure the assassin wasn't on top of it? You can't say anything about it. So obviously explanations need to be forthcoming, but you can see how the thing can be manipulated depending on the secrecy of the agency involved. And so therefore, we need to get to the bottom of that type of secrecy. A group like the continuity of government players don't have any oversight. That's a real problem. And their excuse is they're so super secret and that, it's so sensitive what they're doing that the oversight needs to be that limited. Groups we know, like the CIA and the NSA and others, have overstepped the boundaries of what constitutionally they're allowed to do, of course, over and over again. So therefore, you're looking there at a group that's operating completely outside of the known rules or structures that we're accustomed to. And that seems to be their main advantage. Also, that group seems to be untouchable and like not a very large group. So, and they seem to show up in the midst of these deep events, as Professor Scott has pointed out, and somehow they're related to the emergency planning group of the COG network. And with that, I think as we go forward looking into Thomas Matthew Crooks and his connection and the other people who were helping him and the fact that he was running drones over the site to see where he could shoot President Trump and all the rest of it, it's an earthquake to get to the bottom of this, because you're going to run face to face into the deep state with this. So we're going to see how this plays out, but there's no question that this was a large-scale conspiracy to change the election outcome. And so it rises to the very height of the highest crimes in the United States. So therefore, until we get the full answer on it, we're not going to be whole as a country until we get to the bottom of it. And so we'll certainly try to get to the bottom of it in this program. And with that, Miss Olivia, your last question.
Okay, so we don't have the time tonight to go into JD Vance and Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and everything. I've got lots of questions about them. So we will answer them in a future show.
Yeah, I think that. And I don't think people should run over the cliff with Vance and stuff, because remember last time Trump had Pence, and that is weird that the names are so similar, isn't it? Pence and Vance, 5 letters, NCE at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But this is just one of those things. I think you need to be aware of the backgrounds on these people. But there's a little bit of going over a cliff and being like, Vance is an agent, and all this kind of stuff. I think that his rise in the political situation needs to be looked at. But I think there's a reason why Trump selected him. So we need to kind of get through that a little bit. I mean, right now, the threat of like a Kamala Harris or a Gavin Newsom, weaseling their way into the White House, I think is something much more important. And I think if anything, on the presidency side, we need to be absolutely focused on removing the Biden regime. So, I guess
that's for sure.
Yeah, I moved the Vance thing to a very secondary level of investigation. This other piece around the election, I think, is more important. And you can see that there are worse people like Rubio that were supposedly top VP contenders. Thank God we didn't get that. But I think, it's going to be looked into that Vance is too close to that upper tech group. Yes.
Okay, last question?
Yeah.
All right, so ultimately, John Matthews says, what does DJ think about the tone of the RNC and Trump this week? Seem much more conciliatory, no mention of draining the swamp. And Mr. Wolf says, DJ, any thoughts on Nessun Dorma that was played at the end of the RNC, and it was played at the end of the movie The Sum of All Fears?
True. And but I'll tell you this, that Trump loves that song, and he's done it at more than just the RNC. So, I think this is just part of his big Wagnerian love of opera, but it is also he's always had a big thing, just like he's very into Pavarotti and things of this nature. So the drama, I think, appeals to him. But I think the other piece of that his speech, no, I think the speech came from the heart, because he could have easily been hammering the Democrats more. He could have been hammering the Biden regime more, but he wanted to weave in his personal experience of almost being killed. And somehow this whole thing came together. And, I think the speech could have been punctuated with facts. There could have been more things about what they plan to do. And they could have appealed more to, women and things of that nature. But nonetheless, I think overall, the Republican convention was pretty successful for what they wanted to do. And it got the highest ratings that they've ever got in history for a Republican convention. So there's no question, they're on the right track. I just think the the overconfidence can be a disease around this, and it could also set them up, to get sucker punched with an October surprise. So they have to be very careful. I think what's going to be very important to watch over the next week is this whole Biden situation, because while we see this, huge overthrow piece with trying to get rid of Trump, what they're doing on the Biden side, trying to remove him and install Harris, and then maybe get rid of Harris and install Clinton or something, it hasn't been done. Like the only thing that's close to it is the 68 election, really, where they had to switch out the candidate. And in that case, it was LBJ, who, when Robert Kennedy announced he was running, LBJ said, to himself, I'm sure, I know this deep state is going to kill him. They're not going to allow him to be in there. And I can't be seen as the recipient of 2 Kennedy assassinations. So he removed himself only 3 weeks after Kennedy announced. That tells you a lot. And then they assassinated Kennedy in June of 1968, and they replaced him on the Democratic side with Hubert Humphrey, and that's how Nixon got in. So this kind of plays out like that because, Johnson was still the sitting president, but this guy Humphrey was his candidate. And so now we're going to have Biden as the president and somebody else as the candidate. Supposedly, there's still a move inside the Biden camp to keep it like it is. But I think that the public performance is so poor that basically those forces loyal to Obama and that whole gang are going to take Stepford Biden and switch him out for, Gruesome Newsom or someone like that.
What kind of a deal do you think is being brokered behind the scenes?
I think they're telling him to get out of there.
You think that's it?
Yeah, I mean, I think they've already.
There's money that he will need for his.
I don't even think Biden is in there anymore. Oh. If any deals were being made, it would be with Dr. Jill. Mm-hmm. But I do think that we should all, after this assassination attempt, really look at the political map, and I think the goal should be to remove the Biden regime, who the group on the deep state side is employing the executive action tactics in order to install Biden for a second term. So whatever it is, that needs to be stopped. And I do think that what we get with Trump, again, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, I think that we can look at something with Trump where Trump has a lot of respect for the Constitution. He has a lot of pushback against this force that's in the government trying to destroy America, and he would secure the border, which I think is the number one issue in the country right now. And I also think things like inflation and things like that would be under very different, again, it wouldn't be a cakewalk for whoever walks in, but I think that Trump has the experience, and it would be his last term to really make his mark. So I think that that's where, as far as the election goes, since you only really have those 2 choices, because there's no way for Kennedy to get in at this point. Although I think he'd be a splendid addition to the cabinet, and I hope that he would be. So I think when we look at it like that, we have to hope against hope that Trump does not get assassinated during this process, as it would set up all kinds of dynamics, and it would be just a complete disaster. So we're lucky. And just looking at Trump as a historical figure and all the things that he's been able to do and everything else, he's incredibly lucky to. I remember, I'll share a conversation with astrologer Susan Miller, who's just a remarkable astrologer. And I got the chance to meet her, and I'll tell you, we could not get out of our conversation there for a good while. And we talked for a long time, maybe over an hour during this event. And she said, there were these people in the audience, and they were like, can we get Trump out of office? And he was in office at the time. And she was showing them, and she would say to me later that Trump, she's like, he's just a lucky penny astrologically, like, and I think this event really proved it. The guy has this incredible streak that allowed him, this kind of invisible shield And I think all of his supporters sensed that, but it was very, very close. And so therefore, I think under the circumstances, we have to hope for a great outcome with the election, and it won't be a cakewalk. My message is you have to fight for every vote, and you have to remove the Biden regime in order for America to continue, period, because otherwise they're just going to flood it. And they'll have every excuse in the world to take every kind of criminal and terrorist and as a way to implode America from the inside, which is what the globalist forces around the deep state want to do. Then it just becomes an economic zone. You don't have to worry about the Constitution and all that. So America is very important, I think, in the destiny of the world, and we have to do everything we can to maintain the positive and the right future for America. So hopefully that's what we get. And if anything, I think that 2028 would shape up to be quite the drama, since Trump only is going to get one term if he gets in. And so then you have all sorts of things in play at that point. And with that, Miss Olivia, we're done for tonight.
Okay, I do want to throw one thing out there that I
Sure.
didn't get to. So this is just a quick thing. George Ivankovich said, do you think that astrology is a part of this? We are around magicians. And of course,
Oh,
this
yeah,
was
absolutely.
astrologically predicted by many astrologers.
Yeah. Oh, no, it's incredible. I mean, you can feel it. This period, this mid-July into late July period, is absolutely power-packed astrologically. And I think astrologers are way more on the ball with this than political prognosticators, who are always throwing out things about this guy will be assassinated, or, this disaster, cyber disaster, will happen. And therefore, when something does happen, they're like, aha, I was right. This is another thing that's been bothering me lately, which is I see fully capable adults running around yelling about how they were right in all sorts of media, up and down or whatever. And I understand, I understand it a little, but come on, let's be adults here. It's nice to get things right. Just feel good about it. You have to go out there. I was right. Every time I look at Twitter now, even very responsible people, I was looking at Naomi Wolf's thing, and, I like Naomi Wolf, but she was just sitting there. Everything was like, I was right about this. I was right.
I called
it. Look, thank God we're all right about things sometimes, but geez, it is interesting though. I do think that, one last thing I want to put across here is I think that with all the attention around the independent media and all these people who came out of the network scene, kind of a corrupt network scene, and came in with millions and millions of dollars that they made from this corrupt network scene, and now they kind of move into the independent field and act like they're giving an independent thing, like they came up and did their own independent stuff. It's not really true. It's kind of a facade. And I think you can still get a positive benefit out of it anyway. But I want to go back to the question of potency. I think that we need potency when it comes to this type of reporting. I try to do that type of reporting here on this show. The guests that I have on this program and the colleagues of mine have that potency in their work, and there's nothing that replaces it. So I think the other stuff works kind of like very surfacey frosting on top of the real cake, and they know how to use the buzz terms. They know how to get you whipped up into shape. And I'm not here to make you upset and take your money. I'm here to give you some information on a deep level and maybe share some of that, and then with the ideas room, circulate those types of thoughts and have them kind of ricochet, so we get the best. I do think some of the best minds right there in the ideas room. So I can't thank you enough for that. I'm going to read a quote. This part of the quote, I think, I wanted to go out with a quote by our friend Professor Scott. One more. And before I do that, Miss Olivia, why don't you read off the super chatters?
Okay,
please?
I will do that.
Yes.
give me
You're
one
watching the
second.
Dark Journalist Show. This is Deep State Assassination Executive Action Directive. And we have some of the very best people coming up on the show to talk about this. And just you wait, some exciting interviews coming up. Yes.
Okay. Ramblin' Lamb, High Speed Chase, Bill Monahan, Moses, Jonathan McIntosh, Kathleen Beck, The Bikini Truther, Kimster 182, Fulcanelli, Desk Hat Brock, Srinivas Murthy, The Book Nook, Eurythmia's Fun, Tally Ho, Nancy Mercier, Erica Swenson Elliott, Izzy the Great, C.A. Bever Forden, Jay Parsons, Melody Lenz, Amarillo Gunrunners, Short Order Cook 1, Joseph Fabry, Kevin Bauman, Donna Marie Farrell, John LaCourte, Roosevelt Media News, Terry Doherty, Dog Boy, Black Tie, Empire of Light, Donnie Darko 727, David John Moan. There we go. Okay. I think I got to the end of it.
Wow. Incredible. We appreciate all of your support, and to all of our subscribers, thank you, because it makes a huge difference to the work that we can bring to you. We will be back next week. I have a very special show coming up for you next week. So make sure you're on that newsletter list. You'll hear all about it before anybody else does. And before we go, I'll do a couple of shout outs with everyone here. I know I missed something with some of my photos too. Oh yeah, I ran across this shot of President Kennedy giving his go to the moon address. And I was thinking of a lot of the things going on with space in the next administration with Trump, if we get it, including him talking about reactivating the Star Wars SDI dome, as it were, over the United States, and that incredible campaign, of course, of 1960, where President Kennedy was able to bring the whole country into a new frontier, and how that promise still exists, I think, with us here today. And again, we've got that, the forces that are opposed to that. We got a real kind of close up of them here just recently. Okay, let's do this here. Bruce Shelton, Alan the Alien. That's great. Lindy T. Joseph Farrell. It's great to see you, sir. Of course, Gigi's out there. Incredible. Gigi Young's work, phenomenal. When I talk about potent work, that's what I'm talking about. Cosmos Club 2.0. Exactly. You got it right. S23. Shelley Penn, Gypsy Moon, Roosevelt Theater. You got that. Thanks for keeping it real, DJ and Olivia. Bravo, Olivia. Nice.
Thank you.
Ideas room.
It was tough tonight.
Whew, yeah, incredible. B Nickel, Plan D, Najat. Good stuff tonight, kids. Thank you very much. It's good to see you. Caritas Tarot, Olivia and DJ. We might need more shows a week during the election. LOL.
Yeah, I agree.
No question about it. Golden Girl, Pumphrey Gooch. Whew, fantastic. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Is that Lee Zepp? Lee Zepp. BlackRock dumped Trump media shares the day before. Yeah, isn't that interesting? We'll keep an eye on any kind of financial activity in relation to this. I know that some were floated, and they didn't turn out to be as suspicious as thought. But I think it's an important thing to keep an eye on, and you'll always see it in relation to a deep event. You'll get this whole piece about, during 9/11, there were all these shorts against these airlines, and all these puts, and the short selling and the puts on the options for the airlines, because they knew they were going to have tremendous problems. So there was an incredible cash game. I'm reminded of a very interesting piece that has to do with Ling Temco Vout, or the LTV company that was doing this experimental aircraft stuff. And Professor Scott had told me that D.H. Byrd, as the principal stockholder for that company, had made, from the time of the assassination and owning the Texas School Book Depository, he had made $3 million turn into $55 million. Well, certainly there are a lot of other types of incentives that go into participating in this, but that type of financial incentive in the 1960s to make 55 some odd million dollars, I mean, yeah, so those things are to be watched and understood, and I'm sure we'll see some signs of that here as well. Let's see, Karen Carpenter, it's great to see you. Old as dirt. There we go. What does it say? Thank you both. Informative tonight. Have a good night, everyone. Indeed. Have a fantastic night. Thank you. Have a great weekend, Golden Girl. And Mark, J Rocks the Valley. Don't worry. You can just rewatch the whole show right from the beginning. And unbelievable. This was going to be a short report, but we stretched it out to hours, and we did it all with your help. Thank you so much. Modwiz, of course, is out there and says, I watch every news and views. With Viking, did Musk buy The View? That's fantastic.
I can't believe that show is still on. I mean, who the hell is watching it?
Well, it's just like, they pay Rachel Maddow $35 million, right, to promote wars in Ukraine.
I think, what is it? It's like, I think it's actually $100 million a day she gets.
100 million per day? No,
I'm sorry, $100,000.
100,000 per day.
Yeah,
isn't that ridiculous? Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what she makes, and it's embarrassing. It is truly. But I'll tell you this: that the people are seeing through the fact that these media people have been paid off, and that's where part of the corruption in the media comes from. Is just having the connections, having the money, having the good life. I'm all about people having the good life. There's no problem there. Just tell the truth with something as important as the news politically and around the world geopolitically. It affects people's lives. And you can have no more sacred honor than that. We will see you all next week. And, it says end broadcast, but after all, it never really ends.
Never really ends.
Fantastic. And never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot, and certainly there could be again. Let's hope for a great outcome this November 5th, and hope for a very safe campaign for President Trump and his family. And we will see you all next week.
Let's just all be grateful that we're living in this timeline right now, because it could be so much worse.
Isn't that the truth?
That nightmare is not, we're not experiencing it right now. Thank God.
Incredible.
Glory be to God.
Incredible. Well, let's see how good our luck can get here, as it were. Have a great night, everyone, and we'll see you all next week. Have a fantastic weekend.
God bless.